Hello everyone. I'm the narrator, and I'm here to guide you tonight. I know many of you use this video to drift off to sleep, so before we get started, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Get comfortable, relax, and let me tell you a story I feel compelled to share, even though I wish I didn't have to. I should have known something was wrong the first time I walked down that hallway. The rent for a 3-bedroom house in San Francisco seemed too good to be true. But desperation can make you ignore the warning signs. Now, 3 months later, I'm writing this from a dingy motel room because I can't spend another night in that house. I need to share what happened, if only to try to make sense of it all. It all began in September when I came across the listing on Craigslist. The location was ideal, walking distance from my new tech job, and the price was manageable if I shared it with roommates. I met Mark and Steve through a Facebook group for housing, and we clicked right away. They both worked in tech, seemed normal enough, and had their quirks. Mark, a user interface designer, was a rock climbing enthusiast, while Steve, a back-end developer, played in a local band. The landlord, Mrs. Chen, was an elderly woman who lived on the other side of the city. She showed us the property, a 1920s Victorian house, on a sunny afternoon. The place needed some work, peeling wallpaper, creaky floors, and that musty smell old houses always seem to have. But it had charm, high ceilings, original hardwood floors, and a simple layout. The living room and kitchen were downstairs, while the 3 bedrooms were upstairs, connected by a long hallway with a bathroom at the end. Even during the initial tour, I noticed how much darker the hallway was compared to the rest of the house. Mrs. Chen flipped a switch, and the dim, yellowish ceiling light barely illuminated the space. I assumed the bulb just needed replacing. The previous tenants were nice people, Mrs. Chen said as we signed the lease. They lived here for 2 years but had to move suddenly for work. She hesitated for a moment before adding, "Old houses make noises sometimes. Nothing to worry about." We moved in the following weekend. Mark took the room closest to the stairs, Steve chose the middle room, and I ended up with the one at the far end, next to the bathroom. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. We unpacked, decorated, and adjusted to our new routines. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the hallway was off. It always felt darker there, even in the middle of the day. I told myself it was just shadows cast by the odd angles of the walls, or maybe dark paint beneath the wallpaper absorbing the light. The first incident happened about a month after we moved in. It was late, around 11 p.m. I was returning home from the office. Mark was at his girlfriend's place, and Steve was out with his band. As I walked down the hallway toward my room, I heard it, a faint whisper. So soft, I almost missed it. "Here." I froze. The sound came from behind me. But when I turned around, the hallway was empty. "It's just my imagination," I told myself. I was tired, and it had been a long day. "Old houses make strange noises," I muttered to myself as I hurried to my room, slamming the door shut behind me. But it didn't stop there. Over the following weeks, it happened again. Always at night. Always when I was alone in the house. Sometimes it was just faint, unintelligible whispers, like someone murmuring under their breath. Other times, I could make out fragmented phrases. "Keep looking. Closer." I began to dread going upstairs when I was alone. I'd stay in the living room, pretending to read or watch TV, until Mark or Steve got home. Then, and only then, I'd head upstairs casually, as if nothing was wrong. But the whispers? They never appeared when they were around. One evening I asked them, trying to sound casual, "Have you guys ever heard anything weird in the hallway?" Mark, glued to his phone, didn't even look up. "Just the usual creaks of an old house," he said with a shrug. Steve added, "The hallway's always been strangely dark, though. I've been thinking about adding more lights." We installed 2 wall sconces, hoping they'd help. But just like the ceiling light, their glow only reached a few feet before being swallowed by the suffocating darkness. That's when I started documenting everything. I left my phone recording audio in the hallway while I was at work, but the recordings were always clean, no whispers, no strange noises. I tried taking pictures, but they only showed a dimly lit, ordinary hallway. Then, the whispers grew louder, more frequent. One night in December, around 3 a.m., I was heading to the bathroom. As I passed by Steve's room, I heard it, clear as day. "You don't want to know why." My heart pounded. I spun around, every nerve in my body on edge. The hallway seemed darker than ever, if that was even possible. The lights were on, but their glow felt distant, weak. The darkness between them felt almost solid. And then, I swear, I saw movement. Ripples like black water disturbed by something unseen. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" Silence. Then, right behind me. "We've been waiting for you." I bolted to my room, slamming the door shut and shoving my desk chair under the doorknob. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, every light in my room blazing, jumping at every creak and groan the old house made. By morning, the house was its usual self. Mark and Steve were in the kitchen, casually discussing their weekend plans as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't let it go. I started digging into the house's history. At the local library, I combed through city records and old newspapers dating back decades. The house was built in 1924 by a merchant named George Sullivan. He lived there with his wife until his death in 1947. After that, the house changed hands several times, but nothing unusual stood out. No deaths, no crimes, no mysterious disappearances. Determined, I tracked down some of the previous tenants. "Why did they really leave?" I asked one of them. The woman hesitated, her voice lowering to almost a whisper. "They said the house didn't feel right for them." "What do you mean?" I pressed. She sighed. "They mentioned the hallway, hearing things." I waited, the silence stretching painfully. "Old houses settle. They make noises. It's nothing to worry about," she added quickly, as if trying to convince herself. But I couldn't stop myself. "Did anyone else mention the hallway? Anyone before them?" Her tone turned brisk. "I have to go now. Just remember, the lease agreement is binding. You can't break the contract early." That night, I started locking my bedroom door to a white noise machine. I had to take a long detour outside the house to use the downstairs bathroom at night. But even then, I couldn't completely avoid the hallway. My room was where I kept all my things, my workspace, my life. Then the whispers changed. They became more conversational, as if they were trying to interact with me. "We know you can hear us. Why do you ignore us?" "We just want to talk. You belong here." I started noticing other things. The darkness in the hallway seemed to move at times, shifting and flowing like a slow smoke. The temperature would drop suddenly as I walked through, leaving cold patches that made my breath visible. Objects in my room would appear slightly out of place, not enough to be certain, but just enough to make me question my sanity. So, I installed a motion-activated camera in the hallway. The first night, it recorded normally until exactly 3:17 a.m. Then the screen went black for 6 minutes. When the feed returned, nothing had changed. This happened for several nights in a row. I showed the recordings to Mark and Steve over breakfast. "It's probably just an electrical fluctuation," Mark said, shrugging. "Old houses like this have weird wiring issues." "The camera runs on batteries," I replied. "And nothing else in the house loses power." Steve looked uncomfortable. "Look, I know the hallway is a little strange. But you're obsessing. You should talk to someone." They didn't believe me, of course. Why would they? They'd never heard the whispers. They'd never seen the darkness move. I started wondering if I was losing my mind. But last night was the breaking point. I was working late in my room with my headphones on. Around midnight, I felt a cold draft. I turned around and saw that my door was open. I was certain I had closed it. The hallway beyond was pitch black, darker than ever before. The lights were on, but they looked like distant stars, their glow barely piercing the darkness. Then I saw movement. The darkness wasn't just flowing anymore. It was reaching into my room like black tendrils. And in the center of it, I saw something, a deeper shadow, a void in the shape of a person. It had no discernible features, but I could feel it watching me. The whispers came from everywhere at once. Finally! Come with us. You're ready now. Stay forever. I grabbed my laptop and phone, shoved them into my backpack, and ran. I didn't stop until I was in my car, driving to this motel. I haven't gone back. This morning, Mark texted me. Where are you? Your door is closed, and you're not answering. I told him I was taking some personal days. He replied, Weird thing, the hallway seems brighter today. Steve noticed it too. You don't want to know why. I turned sharply, my heart pounding. The hallway was darker than ever, if that was even possible. The lights were on, but they seemed weaker, more distant. The darkness between them felt almost solid, and I could swear I saw movement, like ripples in black water. Hello? I called out, my voice trembling. Is someone there? Silence. Then, right behind me. We've been waiting for you. I ran, slamming the door to my room and jamming my desk chair under the doorknob. I spent the rest of the night with all the lights on, jumping at every creak and whisper. I left the old house in the morning, and everything seemed normal. Mark and Steve were having breakfast, casually chatting about their weekend plans as if nothing strange had happened. But I couldn't shake the unease, so I decided to dig deeper into the history of the house. The local library had city records and newspapers dating back decades. That's where I discovered that the house had been built in 1924 by a merchant named George Sullivan. He lived there with his wife until his death in 1947. After that, the property changed hands multiple times. Strangely, nothing particularly unusual stood out. No deaths, no crimes, no mysterious disappearances. Determined to uncover more, I tracked down the phone number of Mrs. Chin, one of the previous tenants, and called her. When I asked why they had left the house, there was a long, tense silence. They said the house wasn't suitable for them. She finally responded, her tone guarded. They mentioned something about the hallway, about hearing things. She paused again. Old houses settle. They make noises. Nothing to worry about, she added hastily. Mrs. Chen, please, I urged. I need to know if they experienced anything unusual. She sighed heavily. They said the hallway was too dark, that they heard things. But everyone hears things in old houses. Wind in the walls, pipes, normal stuff. Was there anyone else? Other tenants before them? I pressed. I have to go now, she said quickly. Remember the lease agreement. You can't break the contract early. And with that, she hung up. That's when I started locking my bedroom door at night. I even used a white noise machine to drown out any unsettling sounds. To avoid the hallway, I took long detours outside the house just to use the downstairs bathroom. But I couldn't avoid the hallway entirely. My bedroom held all my things, my workspace, my life. Then the whispers began to change. They became clearer, more conversational. As if they were trying to engage with me. We know you can hear us. Why do you ignore us? We just want to talk. You belong here. I started noticing other things. The darkness in the hallway. It seemed alive, shifting and flowing like slow, heavy smoke. The temperature would drop abruptly, leaving icy patches in the air that made my breath condense. Items in my bedroom began appearing slightly out of place, not enough to be certain, but just enough to make me question my sanity. I decided to set up a motion-activated camera in the hallway. On the first night, it recorded as expected until 3:07 a.m. Then, the footage went black for exactly 6 minutes. When the image returned, nothing had changed. This same pattern occurred for the next 3 nights. I showed the recordings to Mark and Steve over breakfast. Dude, it's probably just an electrical glitch, Mark said dismissively. The camera runs on batteries, I countered. And nothing else in the house loses power. Steve looked uneasy. Look, I know the hallway feels off, but you're obsessing. Maybe you should talk to someone. Of course, they didn't believe me. They never heard the whispers. They never saw the darkness move. I started questioning my own sanity. Last night was the breaking point. I was working late in my room with headphones on when, around midnight, I felt an icy draft. Turning toward the door, I saw it was open. I was certain I had locked it. Beyond the doorway, the hallway was pitch black, blacker than I'd ever seen it. The lights were on, but they seemed feeble, like distant stars barely cutting through the darkness. Then I saw it. Movement. The darkness wasn't just flowing anymore, it was spreading. It crept into my room like living tendrils, black and menacing. In the center, I saw something. A deeper darkness, a void in the shape of a person. It had no distinguishable features, yet I could feel it watching me. The whispers came from everywhere at once. Finally! Come with us. You're ready now. Stay forever. I grabbed my laptop and phone, shoved them into my backpack, and ran. I didn't stop until I was in my car, driving toward this motel. I haven't gone back. This morning, Mark texted me. Where are you? Your door is locked, and you're not answering. I told him I was taking a few personal days. He replied, Weird. The hallway feels brighter today. Steve noticed it too. The first time I found my mother's medallion hanging on the wall, I blamed my girlfriend, Sarah. It made sense. She was the only other person with a key to my apartment. But when I called her to ask, she sounded confused. She hadn't been to my place in over a week. That's when the uneasiness began to settle in. I was in my bedroom, phone still in hand, staring at the brass medallion swaying slightly on a nail that I was certain hadn't been there the night before. Morning light illuminated its surface, making the intricate Celtic pattern appear to shift and move. I had kept that medallion in the top drawer of my nightstand for the past 15 years, ever since Mom passed away. It was the last thing she gave me, pressing it into my hand as she lay in her hospital bed. Take care of it, she had said. Those were her last words to me. And I had taken care of it, keeping it in that drawer where I could see it every morning and every night. Sometimes I'd hold it, feeling the weight of the metal and tracing the patterns with my finger. But I had never hung it up. I never wanted to risk losing it. Yet there it was, displayed on my wall at eye level, like some kind of museum exhibit. I walked over and carefully removed it from the nail. The metal was cold against my skin. Examining the nail, I realized it looked old, as if it had been there for years. But I knew my walls. I had painted this room myself last summer. There had been no nails. I placed the medallion back in its drawer and got ready for work, trying to shake off the strange feeling. By lunchtime, I had almost convinced myself that I must have hung it up and forgotten about it. The mind plays tricks, especially in the morning when you're still half asleep. That night I made sure. I took a photo with my phone, capturing the medallion nestled among my old charging cables and receipts, just to prove to myself where I had left it. The next morning, it was back on the wall. This time, I knew I wasn't imagining things. The nail was in a different spot, about 2 inches to the left of where it had been the day before. I yanked it down so fast the chain tangled. My heart pounded as I examined the wall. The previous day's nail was gone. There was no hole, no mark, nothing to indicate it had ever been there. I called in sick to work and spent the morning searching every corner of my apartment for signs of a break-in. The deadbolt was intact. The windows were all locked. There were no scratches around the locks, no marks on the frames. Nothing was out of place or missing, except for that cursed medallion. Sarah came over that afternoon after I messaged her about what was happening. She could tell I was shaken. I'd barely slept the night before, jumping at every little sound in the apartment. Maybe you should have it appraised, she suggested. turning the medallion over in her hands. Find out more about its origins. Mom never told me much about it, I replied. Just that it was a family heirloom passed down on her side. Well, there's clearly more to it, Sarah said, holding the medallion up to the light. These symbols look Celtic, but there's something off about them. And you can feel how heavy it is for its size. Sarah was right. The medallion was about 2 inches in diameter, but it weighed as much as a solid paperweight. The metal wasn't quite brass, nor was it gold, but something in between. The patterns etched onto it had an almost hypnotic effect, but staring at them too long gave me a headache, like trying to follow a line in an Escher drawing. I'll put it somewhere safer, I said. Just until I can figure out what's going on. I had a small safe bolted to the floor of my closet, usually reserved for emergency cash and important documents. That night, I made room inside and carefully placed the medallion within. Sarah watched me as I turned the dial, double-checking it 3 times to ensure it was securely locked. Call me if anything else strange happens, she said as she left. I could tell she was worried about me, probably thinking I was having some kind of breakdown. That night I barely slept. I lay in bed, listening to every creak and groan of the apartment. Around 3 a.m., I got up to check the safe. The medallion was still there, its dull sheen reflecting the beam of my phone's flashlight. But when I woke up the next morning, the medallion was on my pillow, less than an inch from my face. I shot out of bed so fast I tangled myself in the sheets, crashing to the floor and hitting my elbow on the nightstand. The sharp pain grounded me, forcing me to accept that this was real. In the weeks that followed, the medallion stayed put, no more mysterious movements or unexpected appearances. Sometimes, I would catch it swaying slightly, even when there was no draft in the room. Other times, I'd wake in the middle of the night to see it faintly glowing, casting strange shadows on the walls. I continued reading the journal, piecing together my family's history with the medallion. The entries span generations, each guardian recording their experiences. Some wrote about how the medallion had guided them away from danger. Others described dreams where the patterns on its surface revealed places they needed to visit or people they had to meet. Sarah helped me translate some of the older entries written in Gaelic. These were the oldest records, detailing when the medallion first came into my family's possession. According to those stories, the medallion was a gift from the ancients, meant to create a connection between worlds. It wasn't meant to be hidden away but to be lived with, to be learned from. I, too, began having dreams. They weren't frightening, just visions of the patterns shifting and forming shapes that seemed meaningful at the time but faded upon waking. Occasionally, I'd feel sudden urges to go to certain places or do specific things. When I followed these impulses, they often led to something significant. One day, I felt compelled to take a different route to work. That decision saved me from being caught in a major car accident. Another time, I was drawn to a small, unassuming bookstore I had never noticed before. Inside, I found a collection of Celtic tales that shed more light on the medallion's origins. The medallion no longer tried to scare me. It was simply showing me where I belonged, not locked away in a drawer or a safe, but out in the world, fulfilling its purpose. My mother's final words now made sense. Take care of it. She hadn't meant to protect it by locking it up. She meant to let it be free, to move, to guide, to connect. Months later, Sarah moved in with me. She said she had grown used to the medallion's presence, even finding it comforting at times. It's like having a very quiet, very ancient roommate, she joked. The medallion still moves occasionally, but not to escape. Now, it responds to the world around it, turning toward the door before unexpected visitors arrive or shifting toward the window before a storm. One time, it fell off its nail entirely and that very day, we discovered a gas leak in the building, something that could have turned dangerous. I've started writing my own entries in the journal, adding my experiences to those of my ancestors. Someday, I'll pass both the journal and the medallion to someone else in my family, when the medallion shows me it's time. For now, it seems content to remain where it hangs, on the wall of my room, quietly watching over our lives. The burden of carrying it is not a weight, wrote Mom. She was right about that too. It's not a weight at all. It's a gift, a reminder that there are still mysteries in the world, things that can't be explained or contained. Sometimes, the best we can do is accept them, learn from them, and let them guide us wherever they choose to take us. Every morning when I wake up, I look at the medallion on my wall. At times, it seems to shine just a little brighter, as if it's greeting me with a soft, "Good morning." And every night, before I go to sleep, I whisper the same words my mom wrote in her last entry. Trust it. Trust yourself. And I do. The first time I saw it was on a Tuesday night in October. I remember because I'd just finished a grueling 14-hour shift at the warehouse. My back was aching from lifting boxes all day. The motion-activated light in my backyard flicked on just as I walked past the kitchen window. That's when I noticed it, a dark figure, completely still, standing at the edge of my yard where it meets the forest. I froze in place, my coffee mug hovering halfway to my lips. The figure was tall, easily 6 feet, and unnaturally still. It stood cloaked in the shadows between 2 oak trees, features impossible to discern. It was like staring at a human-shaped void carved into the world. Setting my mug down on the counter, I stepped closer to the window. As I did, the figure shifted, taking a single step back, further blending into the darkness of the trees. My heartbeat quickened, thudding against my ribcage. Pressing my face against the cold glass, I squinted, straining to see it more clearly. The security light cast long shadows across the yard, but the figure was unmistakably there, now partially concealed. I grabbed my phone and the largest flashlight I owned, one of those heavy, metal ones that could double as a weapon. My hands trembled as I unlocked the back door. The crisp autumn air hit my face, laden with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. I stepped out onto the deck, my boots echoing loudly against the wooden boards. "Hey!" I called out, my voice weak against the open expanse. "This is private property." The figure retreated another step, now barely visible, a shadow slightly darker than its surroundings. I switched on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the night as I swept it across the tree line. Nothing. Just trunks, fallen leaves, and empty spaces. My breath came in quick, visible puffs in the chilly air. I descended the deck stairs, the flashlight's beam bouncing with each movement. The security light buzzed behind me, casting a harsh glow over the yard. Beyond its reach, the darkness seemed even deeper. I made it halfway across the yard before stopping, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. That's when I saw it move again, a subtle glide to the left, still lurking within the shadows. My throat tightened, dry as sandpaper. Taking one more step, I watched as the figure slipped further into the forest. Its movements were unnervingly smooth, almost liquid. No sound of footsteps, no rustle of leaves, just silent, fluid motion deeper into the blackness. I stepped back cautiously, retreating until my back collided with the deck stairs. Then I spun around and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I checked it twice to make sure. Next, I lowered all the blinds. The rest of the night was spent in my recliner, facing the back windows, with a flashlight resting on my lap. Sleep wasn't an option. The following morning, I inspected the tree line. The ground was damp with dew, but I couldn't find any footprints. There were no broken branches, no disturbed leaves, nothing to prove that what I saw was real. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Too many long work hours. Too much coffee. Not enough sleep. Then Wednesday night came. Same routine, late shift, aching back, coffee cup in hand. As I heated up a frozen dinner, I deliberately avoided looking at the kitchen window. But curiosity gnawed at me. I had to look. There it was. Same spot. Same motionless figure. My dinner slipped from my hands, the plastic tray crashing onto the tiled floor with a loud clatter. The figure didn't react to the noise. It just stood there, a dark silhouette against the trees. This time, I didn't go outside. I stayed by the window for hours, watching it. And it watched me. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel them. Thursday. Friday. Saturday. Every night it appeared. Always at the edge of the yard. Always retreating if I got too close. I started taking pictures with my phone, but they came out blurry or too dark. I installed a security camera, but the recordings only captured vague shadows. My neighbor, Rick, thought I was losing my mind. Probably just a deer, he said when I tried explaining. Sometimes the light plays tricks on you. But I've seen enough deer to know this wasn't one. Deer move differently. Deer make noise. This thing, whatever it was, moved like smoke. And it made no sound. By Sunday, I'd had enough. I called the police. Officer Martinez came, inspected the property, and took notes. She was professional, but I saw the look in her eyes, the same look people give when they think someone's losing it. She suggested trimming the trees to let in more light, or maybe that local teens were playing pranks. But teenagers would get bored after a few nights. Teenagers would run, laugh, or leave footprints in the mud. This presence was different. Patient. Consistent. Purposeful. But I couldn't figure out what its purpose was. The lack of sleep started affecting my work. On Tuesday, I dropped an inventory box and nearly broke my foot. My supervisor sent me home early. I sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes, staring at the trees, summoning the courage to go inside. That night, I decided to wait. I set up a chair on the deck, bundled in my warmest coat. I brought 2 thermoses of coffee and my flashlight, resting it on my lap. My phone was fully charged. I was determined to stay there until sunrise if that's what it took. At 8:43 p.m., the security light flicked on. I glanced at my phone to note the time, and there it was, right on time, standing between the same 2 oak trees. In the 2 weeks since this began, it had never strayed from that spot. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice firm this time. Fear had given way to frustration, to anger. "Why are you here?" There was no response. No movement. Just that unmoving patience, watching me. At 11:17 p.m., I heard a sound for the first time, a soft scraping, like dried leaves being dragged across concrete. The figure shifted slightly, and I realized the sound was coming from it. My hands gripped the flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. The scraping grew louder as the figure took a step forward, the first step it had ever taken toward me instead of away. My heart pounded against my ribs, every muscle in my body tensed, ready to run. It took another step. Now it was fully in view, no longer obscured by the trees. The security light should have illuminated it, but somehow the darkness clung to its form. It was like looking at a tear in reality, a piece of the night that had decided to rise and walk. The scraping noise grew until it filled my ears, making my teeth vibrate. The figure took another step, then another. It was halfway across the yard now. I lifted the flashlight, my finger hovering over the switch, but I couldn't bring myself to turn it on. Some instinctive part of my brain knew I didn't want to see this thing clearly. I stood up so quickly my chair toppled over with a crash. My legs were trembling. The figure stopped. The scraping ceased abruptly, leaving a silence that buzzed in my ears. We stood there, maybe 20 feet apart, locked in some kind of standoff. Then, it raised an arm. The movement was wrong, too fluid, too angular. It was like watching a time-lapse video of a plant growing but in reverse. The arm kept extending, longer than any human arm could ever be, reaching across the yard toward me. I ran. I slammed through the door, locked it behind me, and sprinted to my room, collapsing against the wall, gasping for air. That night, I didn't look out the window again. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I spent the day installing more security lights, clearing bushes, and trimming tree branches, anything to reduce the shadows. I bought cameras, motion sensors, and even an electric fence system. None of it mattered. The figure reappeared that night, standing in its usual spot despite the floodlights and cleared vegetation. The cameras recorded nothing but static. The motion sensors didn't trigger. The electric fence might as well have been unplugged. But something had changed. Now it was taking steps forward, sometimes. It always stopped halfway across the yard, always raising that impossible arm, always retreating back to the trees. I stopped going to work altogether. I started sleeping during the day and staying awake all night. I ordered blackout curtains for my bedroom windows, bought caffeine pills, and made spreadsheets to track the figure's appearances, its movements, its patterns. And the sounds it made, I needed to understand them, to find a pattern, a reason. The third week, I lost my job. I missed too many shifts, made too many mistakes. When I showed up, Rick stopped coming by to check on me. Officer Martinez didn't return my calls. I didn't blame them. I understood how it must have sounded. The figure grew bolder, night after night. It moved closer each time before retreating. The scratching noise became louder, layered, more intense. Sometimes I thought I could hear words within it, but they were in a language I didn't recognize. I stopped going outside entirely, ordered groceries online, kept the blinds closed. But I could feel it outside, waiting. The air in the house grew thick and stale. The walls seemed to inch closer each day. By the fourth week I broke. The lack of sleep, the isolation, the fear, it wore me down until I felt empty inside. I sat on the kitchen floor at 3 a.m, listening to that endless scratching sound, and made a decision. This had to end. I grabbed my flashlight, threw on my coat, and stepped out onto the deck. The figure was in its usual spot, its arm already rising in that strange movement, like an accelerated growth. I took a deep breath and started walking toward it. This time, it didn't retreat. The scratching grew louder with every step I took. My ears started to ring, and my vision blurred at the edges, but I kept moving. At 10 feet away, I could see more details, though my mind struggled to process them. The darkness didn't cling to the figure. It was part of it. It moved, flowed, like black water rising up. At 5 feet, the arm kept extending toward me, too long, with too many joints. The scratching filled the world around me. My nose started bleeding. 3 feet, 2 feet, 1. I stopped. I raised the flashlight, my thumb on the switch. The figure lowered its arm. The scratching ceased abruptly. In the sudden silence, I heard something like breathing. But it didn't come from the figure. It came from behind me. I turned slowly. Another figure stood in my yard, identical to the first, raising its arm. Then another figure emerged from behind a tree to my left. Another appeared from behind the shed. More came out from the tree line, 2, 5, a dozen, each one with the same impossible shape, each raising an arm toward me. I froze, surrounded by a circle of darkness made form. The flashlight slipped from my numb fingers, hitting the ground with a dull thud. The figures stepped forward, synchronized, one after another. The scratching sound started again, coming from all directions now, a chorus of dry leaves, concrete, and something else. Something hungry. I shut my eyes, felt the air shift as those two long arms moved closer. I waited for whatever came next. Kevin! Hey, Kevin! Rick's voice sliced through the sound, followed by the slam of a car door, footsteps crunching on gravel. I opened my eyes. The figures were gone. Only my backyard remained, empty and gleaming under the security lights. Rick was by the side door, holding a paper bag. I brought you some dinner, he called out. You haven't been answering the phone. We're worried about you, man. I looked around. There were no dark figures, no scratching sounds, just the chirping of crickets. The distant traffic filtered in, and I said, my voice sounded strange to my own ears. It's not safe out here after dark. Rick looked at me with curiosity, but he followed me inside. I locked the door behind him, checking it twice. You look terrible, he said, pulling containers of Chinese food from his bag. When was the last time you slept? I didn't answer. I walked over to the kitchen window and lowered the blinds. I didn't need to look outside. I knew they were out there, waiting, hiding in the shadows. Rick stayed with me for 2 hours. We had dinner and talked about normal things, work, sports, his kids. He pretended not to notice how I jumped at every sound coming from outside. When he left, I walked him to his car. I stayed by the door until the taillights disappeared around the corner, then I went back inside, locked up, and started packing. The next morning, I called my sister in Arizona. I have a spare room, she said. It's really sunny here, not many trees, no shadows where things can hide. I hired a moving company, left most of my furniture behind, and drove west with only what would fit in my car. I didn't look back until Ohio was 3 states behind me. That was 6 months ago. The apartment complex where I live now is all concrete and stucco. My windows face east, catching the sunrise over the desert. I work daytime shifts at a local warehouse, sleep with the lights on. Sometimes I check the local news from my old town, looking for stories about missing people or strange sightings near my old house. Nothing so far. The new owners moved in last month. I think about calling them, warning them, but I know how it would sound. Besides, maybe it was all in my head. Stress, exhaustion, isolation, playing tricks on my mind. That's what the therapist I started seeing says. She's probably right, but I still don't go out after dark. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I hear something that could be a scraping sound, like dry leaves on concrete, coming from just outside my window. I keep the blinds closed. I don't want to know if there's something out there reaching. These marks, he murmured, touching the number 12 with a wrinkled finger. They're strange. It looks like they weren't made from the outside, but from within. I frowned. That doesn't make sense. There's nothing inside the clock that could do that. Frank opened the case and began examining the gears and internal mechanisms. His expression grew more serious as he worked. This is unusual. The gears are in perfect condition, better than perfect, I'd say. No signs of wear, which is impossible for a clock this old. With a small magnifying glass, he examined the marks on the clock's face. And these, he continued, they're not random. They form a pattern that repeats exactly. I moved closer as he pointed to a set of lines and, as I got closer to the curves surrounding the number 12, I realized that I had been right all along. The marks followed a precise design, almost like a coded language that I couldn't understand. Frank straightened up, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. In my 35 years of experience, I've never seen anything like this, he muttered. I can't explain these marks, nor why the gears are in such perfect condition. He dug a little deeper into the mechanism, extracting a small, yellowed piece of paper, worn by age, carefully folded. It had become stuck between 2 gears. This is curious, he said, offering it to me. It couldn't have been here for long or it would have completely jammed the clock. I took the paper carefully. It was covered with symbols, much like the engravings on the clock. As I held it, I felt a faint warmth in the palm of my hand, as if the paper had its own energy. You should consult someone else. Someone who specializes in... Frank hesitated, choosing his words carefully. In uncommon cases. I spent the rest of the day staring at the piece of paper, trying to find any clues that could help, but the markings remained a mystery. That night, the sequence repeated itself. The ticking, the drop in temperature, the squeaking sound that sent chills down my spine. But this time, something was different. At 11:59 p.m., the markings on the face of the clock began to glow with a faint blue light. The buzzing intensified, filling the room like a physical vibration. The paper on my desk started trembling. The symbols on its surface glowed with the same eerie blue light. The clock didn't strike midnight with its usual chimes. Instead, the door of the case slowly creaked open. The space inside the clock was no longer what I knew. The pendulum had disappeared, replaced by a pulsating darkness, an emptiness that seemed to stretch far beyond the physical confines of the clock. There was something in that void, something moving slowly, like ripples in the shadows that stirred within it. The air around me shifted. It smelled of ozone, like before a storm, and the pressure in the room increased until my ears began to ache. Then, on the face of the clock, a new message appeared bright and clear. Time is not linear. The door is opening. I froze, unable to take my eyes off the message. The words glowed on the clock's face, pulsating in sync with the hum filling the room. The void behind where the pendulum once hung began to expand. The darkness seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding like a living organism. I felt a pull in my chest, an unnatural attraction toward that blackness. The paper on the desk shook violently, the symbols on its surface shifting. A new message formed before my eyes. 2 days until the crossing. The choice must be made. My heart raced as I stepped back slowly, distancing myself from the clock. The air felt heavy, as if it was about to collapse around me. Suddenly, the lights in the room went out. All that remained was the eerie blue glow from the markings on the clock, casting long, unnatural shadows across the walls. The paper, in my hands, felt oddly light, yet the emptiness behind the pendulum seemed deeper now, more tangible. I could feel it, a presence, something watching me from the other side. My hands trembled as I held the paper, and I locked myself in my bedroom, turning the key in the door with a sense of urgency. That night I couldn't sleep. The next day, I called Dr. Sarah Chin, a physicist I had met years ago at a conference. I explained everything that had happened, trying to sound as rational as possible, even though a part of me was unraveling with fear. To my surprise, she didn't dismiss my words. "It sounds like a kind of temporal distortion phenomenon," she said, her voice heavy with intrigue. "I can take a look." She arrived that very afternoon, carrying a briefcase full of instruments that I didn't recognize. As she began measuring, her expression shifted from curiosity to fascination, and then to confusion. "The clock is emitting electromagnetic energy patterns," she said, staring at a screen. "But they don't match any known source." I should have known something was wrong when the realtor couldn't look me in the eye while she spoke about the basement. She kept her gaze fixed on her clipboard, listing details about the original wooden floors and the updated electrical system. Now, 3 months after moving in, I sit in my kitchen at 3 a.m., hearing footsteps echoing from downstairs, wondering if I've made the biggest mistake of my life. The house had seemed perfect at first. Built in 1932, it needed some work, but had potential. The price was surprisingly low for the neighborhood, and I convinced myself it was because of the outdated kitchen and bathrooms. I spent 2 months renovating them. Everything brand new, modern appliances, fresh paint, sleek fixtures. I replaced the locks and doors, except for that heavy wooden door leading to the basement. It was made of solid oak, still sturdy after all these years. The previous owners had installed 13 locks, which seemed excessive at the time. Now, I understand why. The first strange event occurred a week after finishing the renovations. I came home from work to find the basement door wide open, warm light spilling onto the hallway floor. I clearly remembered closing those locks that morning. It had become part of my routine. I checked the locks, but they showed no signs of damage. Nothing seemed out of place, except for that door, wide open as if inviting me to go down the stairs. I convinced myself that maybe I had forgotten to lock it properly. The next day, I triple-checked every lock before leaving. That evening, when I returned, the door was open again. The basement lights, which I never used because the switches were at the foot of the stairs, were on. My hands shook as I descended into the basement. It was empty, just as it always had been: concrete walls, exposed pipes, a few boxes of Christmas decorations I hadn't unpacked yet. The light switch was firmly in the off position, even though the fluorescent lights were shining brightly. Finally, I unscrewed the light bulbs, plunging the basement into complete darkness. The next day, I installed an industrial padlock, the kind used on warehouses. I locked the door, tugged on it to make sure it was secure, and went off to work. You can probably guess what I found when I returned. The door was wide open again. The lock was untouched, lying on the floor, and new fluorescent bulbs were glowing in the lamps. I'm not a superstitious person. I don't believe in ghosts, demons, or any of that supernatural nonsense. But I believe in my eyes, in my ears, and in the growing knot of fear in my stomach. Every day, no matter how many locks I install or how securely I fasten them, that door opens on its own. Sometimes I hear noises, footsteps on the stairs, the dragging of furniture, muffled knocks, but the basement is always empty when I check. Last week, I installed security cameras, one pointed at the basement door, another at the foot of the stairs. And one more thing, covering the main room of the basement, the recordings showed nothing. The door appeared closed in one frame, and open in the next, with no sign of movement between the two. I tried to block the door with crossed wooden planks, securing them with 3-inch screws into the frame. But when I returned home, the planks had been removed. They weren't damaged, just carefully aligned on the floor, with the screws neatly stacked beside them. The county records show that the house changed owners 8 times in the last 20 years, with no one staying longer than 18 months. That should have been a red flag. Last night, things escalated. While watching TV, I heard something new coming from the basement. A humming sound. It was a low, unmelodic noise, like someone was absent-mindedly humming. It went on for hours. I didn't sleep at all. Today, I called the locksmith and had him install the most sophisticated electronic lock on the market, complete with fingerprint recognition and a backup keypad. Top of the line. It cost me almost $2,000. I just got home about 10 minutes ago. The door is open. I'm sitting in my kitchen writing this because I need someone to understand what's happening. The warm light from the basement spills into the hallway. I hear slow, deliberate footsteps coming up and down the stairs. Sometimes, the humming turns into something more like words. If I concentrate, I can almost make them out. I've called contractors to seal the basement. I want them to brick it up and cover it with drywall as if it had never existed. It's my last option. The wet sound of something dragging across the floor is getting closer. I feel the coldness growing. My breath is visible in front of me. I shouldn't have trusted that real estate agent who avoided my gaze. I shouldn't have ignored the signs. But now, it's too late. The dragging stops right behind me. I won't turn around. I won't turn around. I won't turn around. I haven't returned to my apartment since I heard the footsteps down the walls. I temporarily moved to a hotel, but I haven't been able to sleep well. Last night, in a dream, the footsteps weren't just above me, they were behind me, following me with every step I took. This morning, the private investigator I hired called me with more information. James Martinez, the construction worker who disappeared, was 42 years old and working overtime to save for his daughter's college tuition. The night he vanished, he was installing fixtures in what would become the 13th floor. His toolbox was found next to an open utility shaft, but there was no trace of him. The investigator also uncovered something that the building management never told me. 3 previous tenants of my unit, 1201, broke their leases and moved out in the last decade. All of them complained about noises coming from the floor above. Tomorrow, I'm going back to the building to collect my important documents. I don't want to, but my boss is losing patience. I've scheduled the visit for noon, when the sunlight is at its peak. I'm planning for more activity in the building tomorrow. I will be bringing a private investigator with me, as well as a friend who has agreed to accompany me on this unsettling journey. We have already reviewed the original blueprints of the building at the city office. According to those, the current 13th floor was never part of the original design. The company decided to close off the 13th floor space due to superstition, but something changed. That floor shouldn't exist at all. As I sit here on the hotel bed, writing all of this down, I'm carefully planning every single detail of tomorrow's visit. I'll be bringing a thermal camera, an industrial flashlight, and audio recorders. I've gone over every possible exit in the building, every potential place where we could hide if things go south. But there's something else that has been haunting me. In the building's blueprints we reviewed, the utility shaft where James' toolbox was found is not marked. It's as if someone deliberately tried to hide it. Tomorrow will be my last visit to Highland Towers. Once I retrieve my things, I will never return. Today, we arrived at the building exactly at 12:07 a.m., as planned. Frank, the building manager, reluctantly let us in, clearly suspicious because I hadn't explained the full details of our visit. I told him I was just there to pick up a few things from my apartment, and although he seemed to suspect something, he didn't ask any more questions. The private investigator and I headed for the 13th floor. The lock that had been broken that night had been replaced, but this time, I had the tools necessary to open it without issue. The door creaked as we entered, and the air inside was thick, much colder than it should have been at noon. The thermal camera detected temperature anomalies on the walls and floor. The footprints in the bedroom dust were still there, but now they were deeper, as if someone had been walking in circles. That's when we heard the first step. A loud thud that reverberated throughout the empty apartment. My friend stepped back a little, but the investigator and I pressed on. I turned on my flashlight, pointing it toward the master bedroom area. The thermal camera picked up something moving, a dark shape with no heat signature, slowly drifting toward us. The investigator muttered something under his breath and took a step back. "That's not human," he whispered. The step came again, this time much closer. The sound filled the room as if the building itself were responding to us. "We need to leave," my friend said, pulling on my arm, but I couldn't move. The dark shape stopped right in front of us. For a moment, it seemed to turn its head toward me, even though it had no face. I could feel its gaze, like it knew exactly who I was. The investigator cursed under his breath and spun toward the exit. I finally snapped out of my trance and followed, with my friend running behind us. Once we reached the hallway, the footsteps followed us. Now there were more than one set of steps, echoing in a strange rhythm that didn't sound human at all. We bolted down the stairs, ignoring the elevator behind us. The footsteps continued, but never passed the 13th floor. When we finally reached the ground floor, we didn't stop until we were outside the building. I looked up and saw something in the window of apartment 1301, a dark, unmoving shadow watching us. I immediately called the real estate agent as soon as I got back to the hotel. "My contract will be terminated this week. Let Highland Towers keep its secrets for now. I've begun documenting everything. I don't know if anyone will believe me, but I want there to be a record because every night, even here in the hotel, in the quietest moments, I swear I can hear footsteps on the roof." The first thud came at 3:17 a.m. I know because I checked my phone, cursing whoever it was making noise at that hour. Living on the top floor of Highland Towers was supposed to mean peace and quiet, but that was before I discovered the building's dark secrets. I paid a premium price for apartment 12, hoping for peace and quiet, but instead, heavy footsteps echoed above me. Each step sent vibrations through the ceiling, causing my whole body to tingle. I lay there, staring at the white textured popcorn ceiling, following the steps as they moved from what would have been the living room to what should have been the bedroom of apartment 1301. The footsteps were deliberate, slow, as if someone was wearing work boots, planting each foot with purpose. After about 15 minutes of this, I put on my robe and headed for the elevator. The night manager was going to hear about this. I had been living here for 3 years, and while the building wasn't perfect, this level of disturbance was unacceptable. The lobby was dimly lit at that hour. Frank, the elderly night manager, was sitting at his desk, working on a crossword puzzle. He looked up as I approached, his reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose. "Mr. Davidson, you're awake at this hour?" he said, setting his pen down. "Someone's in 1301. I said, my voice laced with irritation. "They're walking around above me, like they're wearing cement boots." Frank's thick eyebrows furrowed in confusion. 1301? "That's impossible, Mr. Davidson. I can hear them clearly," I insisted. Frank removed his glasses and wiped them on his shirt. "The 1301 apartment's been empty since June when Mrs. Rodriguez moved out. We've been renovating it. The door's locked with a padlock." My throat went dry. "Then who's walking up there? It must be the building settling. These old towers make all kinds of noises at night," Frank said, dismissing my concerns. I shook my head. "These aren't settling noises. They're heavy footsteps, like someone's pacing back and forth." Frank sighed, rummaging through his keyring. "Let's take a look. It'll put your mind at ease." The elevator ride to the 13th floor felt longer than usual. When the doors opened, the hallway was dark except for the emergency lights. Our footsteps echoed off the marble floor as we made our way to 1301. Just as Frank had said, a heavy padlock secured the door. He unlocked it and switched on his flashlight before stepping inside. The apartment was completely empty. Dust sheets covered the floors, and the walls were bare. Paint cans and tools were scattered around. The air reeked of plaster and abandonment. We checked every room, but there were no signs of anyone entering. No footprints in the dust. The windows were sealed. "Everything good?" Frank asked, his voice sounding like a formality. I nodded, feeling foolish, but as soon as I returned to my apartment, the footsteps started again. That was 3 weeks ago, and they haven't stopped since. Now, they follow a pattern. They start around 3 a.m., always with that first heavy stomp, followed by pacing for about an hour. Sometimes they stop right above my bed, just lingering there. I can feel the weight pressing down through the ceiling. I've called the police twice, but they found nothing. The building maintenance crew came to check the ceiling, the ventilation system, the electrical wiring. Nothing explains the noises. I recorded the footsteps on my phone, but the footage came out distorted, just static and low rumbles. Last night, I had had enough. At 3:15 a.m., I sat up in bed, waiting for the first heavy stomp. It came right on time. I got dressed quickly, grabbed my toolbox from the closet, and headed for the emergency stairs. The building was eerily quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioning. As I climbed the stairs to the 13th floor, I felt the weight of the silence around me. The padlock was still in place. I looked both ways down the empty hall, then pulled out my drill. The lock would need to be replaced, but that wasn't my priority anymore. I needed to see this for myself. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. My flashlight sliced through the darkness. The footsteps continued overhead, but that was impossible. I was on the top floor, and this was where the sounds were coming from. I moved through the empty rooms, checking every corner, every closet. The footsteps always seemed to move ahead of me, right into the next room. My flashlight flickered, and the air grew colder. In the master bedroom, I found something new. A single boot print in the dust. It hadn't been there during Frank's inspection. As I stared at it, a step echoed directly behind me. I spun around, my flashlight catching something moving for a split second. A shadow, maybe? But the air felt heavy, as if someone was standing there, watching me. I backed out of the apartment, slammed the door shut, and ran down the stairs back to my unit. I didn't stop until I was inside, all the lights on. The footsteps continue, and I can't seem to find peace. They're still there, pacing above me, just like before. Only now, I know there's something more sinister at play. My back pressed against the wall, the footsteps continue to follow me, resuming their pace above my head. This morning, I called a real estate agent. I don't care about breaking my contract or losing my security deposit. The agent told me something that left me frozen. There had been a construction accident when this tower was built back in the 1980s. A worker disappeared during the final stages of construction. They searched the building for days but never found him. The idea of going back for my belongings terrifies me, but I know sooner or later I'll have to. And if something is waiting for me when I return. I should have never bought that mirror at the Mason Street antique shop. The worn sign, the dusty window, and the smell of mold should have been warning signs enough. But the mirror, with its intricately carved mahogany frame and slightly wavy glass, caught my attention. It seemed perfect to hang on the empty wall in my living room. The elderly man with thick glasses assured me it was from the 19th century. After a brief haggle, he agreed to sell it to me for $100. When we took it to my car, he gave me one last piece of advice. Keep it covered when you're not using it. The sunlight is not good for the frame. I didn't think much of it. That night I hung it on the wall. Although it was heavy, I managed to secure it firmly after several attempts with wall anchors. I sat down on the couch with a beer, admiring how the mirror reflected the light from my floor lamp, giving the living room a brighter, more spacious feel. That's when I saw the first movement, a flash in the mirror, something that quickly passed by the reflection as if someone had crossed the room. I turned immediately, but the room was empty. I convinced myself it was just a trick of light and shadows, maybe an illusion caused by the wavy glass. In the following days, the mirror became a regular object in my home. I'd glance at it while passing by, fixing my hair, or simply appreciating the aesthetic effect it added to the room. But then, one night, while watching TV, I noticed it again. This time, it was clearer. A dark, humanoid figure moving through the reflection. My heart stopped. I turned my head toward the room, but once again, it was empty. From that night on, the movements in the mirror became more frequent. Dark figures, sometimes one, sometimes several, would cross the reflection. Always in my peripheral vision. I could never see them directly. They only moved when I wasn't looking straight at them. A week after hanging the mirror, one of the figures stopped. It was a more solid black silhouette than the others, frozen in the reflection behind my own image. My reflection looked normal, but that thing was there, motionless, as if it were watching me. I couldn't move. My breathing became rapid and shallow. Finally, when I gathered enough courage to turn and look directly at it, it had vanished. I stopped sleeping well. Every nighttime sound made me jump. My eyes were constantly fixed on the mirror, waiting for something to move. One night, I tried covering it with a sheet, but even then, I felt something stirring behind the fabric. The worst came a month later. I woke up on the couch after falling asleep in front of the TV. Something made me open my eyes. In the mirror, a taller, more defined figure than the others was standing behind my reflection. It was as black as the void, with contours that seemed to distort slightly. Its long, thin hand slowly rose toward my reflected shoulder. I couldn't breathe. I felt an intense cold on my shoulder, as if someone was touching me. My phone suddenly rang, breaking the moment. The figure disappeared, and my reflection returned to normal. But I knew I couldn't stay. That night I slept in my car. The next day, I called a moving service to remove the mirror. No one would touch it after I tried explaining what had happened. So, I ended up covering it with a blanket and lowering it myself into the trunk of my car. Now it sits there as I write this, wrapped in a blanket. Every time I check the trunk, it seems like the blanket shifts slightly, as if something inside is alive. I'm driving out to the outskirts of the city, looking for a deep lake or some remote place to get rid of it. But as I glance at the rearview mirror, I can't shake the feeling that something inside the mirror is watching me. I hope I find a place soon. I can't carry this with me any longer. The old rotary phone rests on the nightstand in my bedroom. It's been there since my grandfather passed away last month. It was just another keepsake I couldn't part with after cleaning out his house. The cream-colored plastic has yellowed over time, and the metal dial makes a satisfying click, click, click when you turn it. I kept it purely out of nostalgia. It's not even connected. That's why the ring startled me at 3:17 a.m. last Tuesday. The harsh sound of the mechanical bell sliced through the darkness, making me sit up abruptly in bed. My heart pounded against my ribs as I stared at the phone, trying to process what I was hearing. The ringing continued, 2 short rings, a pause, then repeating. The same pattern I remembered from visits to my grandparents' house during my childhood. This can't be possible. The soft murmur of music flooded the room. The phone kept ringing. I picked up the receiver. My palms were sweating against the plastic. Hello? Hello? The static crackled in my ear, along with something else, a faint sound like a gasp. Then I heard it clearly. Laughter. It wasn't joyful or friendly. It was weak and eerie. The broken, stuttering laugh that made the hair on my arms stand on end lasted maybe 5 seconds before the line fell silent. I stood there, holding the receiver, listening to the silence. My hands were shaking as I returned it to its place. I followed the cord to where it disappeared behind the nightstand. When I pulled it out, the end was frayed and torn, just as I knew it would be. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the phone had stored some charge in its capacitor somehow. Perhaps I had imagined the whole thing. By morning, I had almost convinced myself it was nothing, until it happened again. The next night, the bell started ringing at 3:21 a.m. I stayed in bed for several rings, watching as the phone vibrated slightly with each chime. Finally, I picked it up. "Who's there?" I demanded. The static was louder this time. The laughter arrived with more intensity. It was still that same stuttering gasp, but now there were multiple voices overlapping, creating a chorus of sounds that churned my stomach. It lasted longer than before, maybe 15 seconds. When it ended, I slammed the receiver down with such force that I almost dropped it. My hands were trembling so badly I had to grip the edge of the nightstand to steady myself. Sweat soaked through my shirt. I spent the next day researching old phones, searching for any explanation. Maybe it was picking up radio signals or interference from nearby lines, but nothing I found made sense. That night, I took the phone apart completely. The internal components were dusty but intact. There was no battery, no power source, no way it could make a sound. I left the pieces scattered across my desk. "Try ringing now," I murmured. At 3:24 a.m., the sound of the bell jolted me awake. The phone, still disassembled, lay in pieces, but the bell rang as clearly as ever. The receiver was among the scattered parts, the cord cut. My voice trembled as I picked it up. "What do you want?" The static exploded immediately, followed by that terrible laughter. More voices had joined the chorus, sounding as if the laughers were pressing their mouths right up to my ear. The sound filled my head, making it almost impossible to think. My whole body froze when a voice rose above the rest, a wet, gurgling laugh that couldn't possibly come from human vocal cords. I threw the receiver across the room. It crashed against the wall, leaving a dent in the drywall. The laughter stopped instantly. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I gathered the pieces of the phone and stuffed them into a trash bag. I drove to the dumpster behind my apartment building and threw it in. Then I sat in my car until dawn, too terrified to go back inside. The following night, I checked into a hotel. I took a sleeping pill and fell asleep watching TV. The phone on the nightstand woke me at 3:27 a.m. I knew before I picked it up what I was going to hear. First came the static, then the laughter, but this time, it was deafening. Dozens of voices laughing and howling with joy, as if they were celebrating something. One voice uttered words I couldn't quite make out, and the others responded with new bursts of laughter that made my ears ring. I hung up abruptly and ran out of the room. The night clerk looked alarmed when I burst into the lobby. "Sir, is everything all right?" "The phone in my room." "Who's calling it?" He checked his computer. "There are no external lines connected to the rooms at the moment. We're updating our phone system. The phones are just for decoration right now." I drove home in a state of shock. The sun was rising when I parked. I hadn't slept more than a few hours in days. My hands were still shaking as I opened the door to my apartment. The old rotary phone was on my nightstand, fully assembled, looking exactly as it had when I brought it from my grandfather's house. I stepped back slowly from the bedroom and closed the door. After a moment's thought, I shoved a chair under the doorknob. I then collapsed. The old house my grandfather had lived in had been sold, but I found the new owners working in the garden. They were a friendly middle-aged couple who invited me in when I explained who I was. "Actually, we had a question about the phone lines," said the husband. "The inspector noticed something unusual in the wiring, but we haven't had time to look into it." He pointed to a panel behind where the desk used to be. "These markings don't match any standard telephone wiring diagram." I knelt down to take a closer look. Carved into the wood around the phone jack were dozens of tiny symbols, circles, and... I stared in confusion at the lines organized into patterns I didn't recognize. They formed a perfect ring around the plug. My grandfather had been involved in something connected to the occult. Hesitantly, his wife asked, "Did we find similar marks in other rooms? Always around the phone jacks?" I slowly shook my head. "Not that I knew of. He worked as a telephone engineer. He spent his whole life at the phone company." The husband scratched his head. "Well, we're planning on updating all the wiring anyway." I sat in my car for what felt like an eternity after I left. I couldn't stop thinking about my grandfather. He never seemed interested in anything supernatural. But then I remembered how insistent he was on having phones in every room, even after everyone switched to cell phones. I recalled how he would obsessively check the lines, testing connections, and replacing wires. Sometimes, he would sit in his study late at night, holding the receiver to his ear, listening intently. What was he hearing? That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, staring at the bedroom door. Exactly at 3:30 a.m., the bell rang again. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the sound pierced through clearly. After 12 rings, it stopped. Then the laughter started to seep out from beneath the door. It was so loud now that I didn't need a receiver to hear it. The voices had a frantic quality, as if they were reaching a climax. The chair I had placed under the doorknob rattled against the door as something made the whole room tremble. A new sound joined the chaos, an array of clicks and snaps, like someone dialing numbers rapidly on a rotary phone. The laughter grew louder, feverish. Static filled the air, sending shivers down my spine. The lights flickered and went out. In the darkness, I heard the bedroom door creak open slowly. The static increased, turning into a physical pressure against my ears, as if it was pushing my head down. The laughter now echoed from every corner of the room, surrounding me. Amidst the noise, I finally made out words. "Wrong number! Wrong number! Wrong number!" The voices howled in glee. My vision blurred as the pressure mounted. Just before I lost consciousness, I saw it. The old rotary phone floating in the center of the room, its cord twisting like a living serpent, the dial spinning wildly. I woke up in the hospital. The doctor told me my neighbors had found me unconscious in the hallway outside my apartment. They diagnosed me with extreme exhaustion and kept me under observation. When I went home 2 days later, the phone was gone. In its place was a note, written in my grandfather's shaky handwriting. They keep trying to call through. I stopped them as much as I could. Your grandmother and I did it. I'm sorry, I should have destroyed the phones before I died. Now they'll find someone else to dial. Just remember, never answer a call after midnight. Never give them a connection. All they need is a voice to answer. A voice to open the line. I moved out of that apartment and changed my phone number. I no longer have a landline. Still, sometimes late at night, I hear the ghostly ring or echoes of that terrible laughter. But as long as I don't answer, as long as I don't complete the connection, I know I'll be safe. What worries me, though, is the number of old phones still out there. Those obsolete landlines, gathering dust in homes, waiting to make a call. And all those people in their offices who could answer when they hear that first ring in the early morning. That's why I'm sharing this warning. If a disconnected phone starts ringing after midnight, do not answer it. Do not give them a voice. On the other side of the line, they're dialing randomly, desperately, endlessly, and they only need one person to pick up. Let it ring. Music. The metal groaned under our boots when Mike and I heard the first whisper. It came from below, from the depths of that abandoned silo we were exploring. We froze on the rusted staircase, our flashlights casting beams of light that barely cut through the decades of dust that had built up. "Did you hear that?" Mike whispered, his voice tense. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me from my position above him on the staircase. We'd explored dozens of abandoned places over the years, factories, old houses, train tunnels, but something about this place felt wrong. The air was thick, as if the darkness itself was alive. The whispers intensified now, with multiple voices swirling like waves of murmurs from above. They seemed to be coming from the upper chamber of the silo, where the old loading equipment was stored. "We should take a look," Mike said, with that familiar tone of excitement I'd known since we were kids. He was always curious about what lay beyond, even if it meant getting into trouble. "They could be vagrants or worse," I replied, trying to sound rational, but the voices didn't sound human. They were distorted, as if coming through water or static. "There's only one way to find out," Mike said. He kept climbing, and I reluctantly followed, my hands sweating as I gripped the cold steps. As we ascended, our flashlights illuminated marks on the walls of the silo, deep scratches that cut through the rusted metal. "Look at this," Mike murmured, pointing to a cluster of fresh scratches that gleamed under the light. I ran my fingers along the grooves. They were deep, at least an inch, and the edges were sharp. "What could make something like this?" I asked. "Nothing you'd want to meet," he answered with a nervous smile. The whispers grew clearer as we climbed. When we finally reached a maintenance platform about 60 feet up, the sounds seemed to surround us. The metal floor was buckled in places, as though something heavy had slammed into it. Scratch marks were everywhere. "Look," Mike said, pointing to a large metal gate hanging open. Its frame was twisted beyond recognition. A cold wind whistled through the opening, carrying with it a strange, metallic, slightly sweet smell. "Let's see what's up there," Mike insisted, moving toward the opening. "Are you crazy? Something strong enough to tear metal apart is up there. We should leave." But he didn't listen. He was always pushing the limits. I followed, my heart pounding. The gate led to a narrow maintenance tunnel, filled with more destruction, dented walls, torn floor plates, and deeper claw marks. At the end of the tunnel, another gate, completely ripped off its hinges, led into the upper chamber of the silo. Our flashlights illuminated the vast space. It was cavernous, with old conveyor belts hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the room, a figure moved. It was huge, the size of a bear, but it moved with the grace of a feline. Its body was covered in glossy black fur that seemed to absorb the light. The claws of its paws clicked against the metal floor. "What the hell is that?" Mike murmured, as we both aimed our flashlights at the creature. Suddenly, two more figures slid down from the ceiling. They were smaller, but just as strange. Their eyes reflected our flashlights like mirrors, and their bodies seemed to shift shape, moving as if they were liquid. The whispers grew louder, now turning into a cacophony. We could make out words: hunger, feed, stay. "We have to get out of here!" I screamed. Mike pulled a flare from his backpack, and the world went dark as everything around us seemed to close in. Mike lit the flare, and the red light filled the room, forcing the creatures to retreat. Their bodies distorted, their edges blurring as if they were losing their solidity. "They don't like the light," Mike said, raising the flare. We ran back into the tunnel, the creatures following closely behind, their claws echoing against the metal. I didn't stop running until we were outside the silo, breathing in the fresh night air. The creatures halted at the entrance, unable, or perhaps unwilling, to cross the threshold. Their bodies twisted in frustration as their voices rang out in our minds. "Stay, feed us." We didn't stop running until we reached Mike's car. That night, we made an anonymous call to the police, reporting strange activity at the silo. A week later, we passed by the place and saw that the entrance had been welded shut, surrounded by warning signs. Since then, Mike and I have continued exploring abandoned places, but we're more careful now. We always carry flares, and we never ignore the warning signs, especially when we hear whispers. The first time I noticed something strange about the grandfather clock was on a Tuesday night in October. I was sitting in my living room, trying to concentrate on some work emails, when the deep, resonant chimes that had been a constant background in my life for the last 15 years suddenly stopped mid-strike. The silence caught my attention immediately. I looked up from my laptop screen to see the hands of the clock frozen at 11:58 p.m. It wasn't unusual since my phone showed it was only 7:43 p.m. I stood up from my leather armchair and walked over to the imposing timepiece. I opened the glass door that protected its face. The brass hands felt cold under my fingers as I tried to wind it. Time resumed, the familiar tick-tock starting up again as soon as I closed the door and returned to my work. 20 minutes later, the chimes sounded again, midnight. I frowned and checked my phone, 8:03 p.m. The hands of the clock had gone back to 12, despite my adjustment. It must be a mechanical issue, I thought, making a mental note to call a technician the next day. The next morning, I found the clock had stopped again, at midnight. But this time, something else caught my eye, fine scratches on the clock face that I was sure hadn't been there before. They weren't deep, but they were definitely new, forming a strange pattern around the number 12. I ran my finger along the marks, feeling the slight indentation on the smooth surface. I called the watch repair shop in the center and described the problem to the owner, an elderly man named Frank, who had serviced the clock in the past. He seemed puzzled by my description but agreed to come take a look the next day. That night, I decided to stay awake to observe the clock. I set up my laptop on the coffee table, made a strong cup of coffee, and settled into the armchair, expecting a boring night of catching up on work while keeping an eye on the clock. The hands moved normally until 11:57 p.m. At that moment, the rhythm of the tick-tock changed. It slowed down, becoming heavier, as if the ticks were footsteps on an old wooden staircase. My skin prickled. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The minute hand crawled toward midnight with agonizing slowness. At 11:59, the pendulum began to swing erratically. Instead of its usual constant arc, it now swung in irregular patterns, sometimes wide, sometimes narrow. The sound it made also changed. No longer was it the familiar tick-tock but a scraping, scratching noise that sent shivers down my spine. My hands gripped the armrests of the chair as I watched, unable to look away. The second hand shook and trembled as it moved around the clock face. When it finally reached 12, the clock didn't chime. Instead, It emitted a sound as if someone were dragging their nails across a chalkboard. The hands spun rapidly backward, moving counterclockwise, until they stopped again at midnight. I jumped to my feet and rushed to the clock, my heart pounding in my chest. New, deeper marks had appeared on the clock face, forming a pattern that almost looked like words, but I didn't recognize the alphabet. My fingers trembled as I tried to touch the marks. The glass was icy cold. I quickly pulled my hand away. I stepped back. The pendulum had stopped moving completely, but there was still a sound coming from inside the box, a low hum that made my dental fillings vibrate. The air around the clock seemed to ripple, like heat rising off the hot pavement. I spent the rest of the night on my sofa, watching the clock from across the room. It remained frozen at midnight, with that strange hum continuing until dawn, when it suddenly stopped and resumed its normal ticking, as if nothing had happened. Frank arrived right on time at 9 a.m. He was a short man with thick glasses and hands that showed the years of meticulous work he had put into his craft. I explained what had happened while he carefully examined the face of the clock. "These marks," he said, adjusting his glasses, "are unusual. The pattern suggests they were made from inside the clock, not from the outside." "That's impossible," I replied. "There's nothing inside that could make marks like that." Frank opened the clock's case and began to examine the mechanism. His expression grew more concerned as he worked. "The gears are in perfect condition," he said. "Better than perfect, actually. They show no signs of wear, which is impossible for such an old clock." He pulled out a magnifying glass and leaned in closer. "These marks aren't random," he continued. "They form a specific pattern, one that repeats itself. Look here." He pointed to a series of marks curving around the number 12. "This section appears exactly the same 4 times around the dial." I leaned in to look where he was pointing, and he was right. The scratches formed a precise geometric pattern that I hadn't noticed before. My stomach churned as I realized that they hadn't been there that morning. They were new. Frank continued his examination, opening panels and checking mechanisms that I didn't even know existed in the clock. After nearly an hour, he sat back on his heels and wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. "In 35 years of repairing clocks, I've never seen anything like this," he said. "Mechanically, everything is perfect. Too perfect. But these marks," he shook his head, "I can't explain them. And there's something else." He reached into the clock's case and carefully pulled out a small object. It was a piece of paper, yellowed with age, folded tightly into a square and wedged between 2 gears. "This was hidden inside," Frank said, handing it to me. "It looks old, but it couldn't have been there long, or it would have jammed the mechanism." I took the paper carefully. The symbols on it seemed to shift slightly as I looked at them, as if they were alive on the page. My head began to throb, and I quickly placed the paper on the coffee table. Frank slowly put away his tools, his usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. "I can't fix what's not broken," he said, "but I'd recommend you find someone who specializes in unusual cases." After he left, I sat in front of the clock and the piece of paper. The ticking seemed louder now, more insistent. I picked up the paper again, forcing myself to study the symbols despite the headache they caused. They reminded me of something I'd seen before, but I couldn't pinpoint what. I spent the afternoon searching the internet, looking into watchmakers and mysterious symbols, but found nothing that matched what I was seeing. As night fell, my anxiety grew. The ticking of the clock seemed to fill the entire house, drowning out every other sound. At 11:57 p.m., I was ready. I had set up a video camera on a tripod, pointed directly at the face of the clock. My phone was recording audio. I sat in my armchair, looking through the camera's viewfinder as the minute hand neared the 12. The same sequence of events began: the slowing of the ticking, the drop in temperature, the erratic pendulum. But this time, something new happened. When the second hand reached the 12, the marks on the clock's face began to glow with a faint blue light. The hum started again, but it was different this time. It had a pattern, almost like a language. The paper on the coffee table vibrated in response to the sound. The marks on it glowed with the same blue light as the watch. Suddenly, my video camera shut off. The screen on my phone went completely black. The room was engulfed in darkness, except for the glowing marks on the watch and the paper. The buzzing sound grew louder, and I felt a pressure building up in my ears. Then, the door to the watch box opened on its own. The pendulum had stopped moving, but the space behind it seemed darker than it should be, as if something deeper than the box itself had opened. The blue glow from the marks cast strange shadows, moving in ways shadows shouldn't move. I wanted to run, but my body refused to obey. The buzzing had turned into a physical force, pressing against my skin. The marks on the paper began to rearrange themselves, forming patterns my eyes could barely focus on. Then, as suddenly as it all began, everything stopped. The lights returned. My devices rebooted. The watch resumed its normal ticking, showing the correct time, 12:01 a.m. The marks on the watch and the paper had stopped glowing, but something had changed. Now they formed a clear message in English. Time is not linear. The door is opening. I spent the rest of the night researching these words online, searching for similar experiences or any kind of explanation. I found nothing concrete, but I did come across some interesting discussions about temporal anomalies in dimensional physics. The more I read, the more I started to understand that what I was experiencing might be beyond any traditional mechanical malfunction. The next day, I called several universities, trying to find someone who might be interested in studying the phenomenon. Most dismissed me immediately, but one physics professor, Dr. Sarah Chin, agreed to come and take a look. She arrived that afternoon with a bag full of equipment. Dr. Chin spent several hours taking readings and measurements. Her instruments recorded strange energy patterns around the watch, particularly near the marks on its face. The temperature around the watch was consistently 3 degrees Celsius lower than in the rest of the room, even under direct sunlight. "These readings are fascinating," she said, studying the display on one of her devices. "There's a constant pattern of electromagnetic disturbances centered around the watch, but it doesn't match any known form of energy emission." She leaned in toward the marks, tracing them with her finger. "These marks aren't scratches in the traditional sense. The material hasn't been removed or displaced. It's been altered on a molecular level." As night fell, Dr. Chin set up more sophisticated equipment, particularly interested in the period just before midnight. At 11:57, the familiar sequence began again. This time, her instruments captured everything: the drop in temperature, the electromagnetic fluctuations, the strange audio frequencies. When midnight struck, the blue glow appeared once more, but this time, her instruments showed something more: a distortion in space around the watch, like a ripple in reality itself. "This is incredible," she whispered, gazing at her readings. "These patterns are similar to theoretical models of temporal distortion. It's like the watch is creating a localized time anomaly." The paper on the coffee table began to vibrate again. New marks appeared on it and on the face of the watch, forming another message. "The end is approaching. TR days remain." Suddenly, Dr. Chen's equipment stopped working. The room returned to normal. She quickly packed up her gear, promising to return the next day with more specialized instruments. That night, I couldn't sleep. The ticking of the watch seemed to follow me throughout the house. Even in rooms far from the living room, the paper remained on the coffee table, and the marks seemed to move if I looked at them out of the corner of my eye. The next morning, I called my father. I needed to know more about the history of the watch. He answered on the third ring, his voice cheerful as always. When I asked about the watch, he said it was your grandfather's pride and joy. He bought it at an estate auction in 1947. He never told us much about where it originally came from. He paused. There was something strange about it, though. Your grandfather used to say it helped him make important decisions. He said it would show him things sometimes, in the reflections on the glass. We all thought he was being dramatic. I pressed him. Did anything unusual ever happen with it? Any mechanical issues? Well, there was one thing, he said, his voice growing serious. A month before he died, he called me in a panic. He said the watch was trying to tell him something important. I drove to his house to see it, but everything seemed normal. The watch was working fine. He never mentioned it again. I thanked him and hung up, my mind racing. An hour later, Dr. Chen arrived with new equipment. She spent the day taking more readings and consulting with colleagues over video calls. The marks on the face of the watch had multiplied overnight, spreading in intricate patterns across the dial. When midnight came, we were ready. The sequence began again, but this time, the blue glow was even brighter. The hum had taken on a different quality, more urgent, more intense. The space behind the pendulum seemed to stretch in an impossible way. New marks appeared, forming another message. Today, pay when the paths align. The choice must be made. The new equipment of Dr. Chen had captured even more data. The spatial distortion around the clock was stronger, creating what she called a temporal vortex centered around the pendulum. The temperature in the room dropped to near freezing. These readings are off the scale, she said, her voice tense with excitement. The energy patterns are consistent with theoretical models of temporal dilation. It's as if the clock is creating a bridge between different temporal planes. The last day was the strangest of all. Time seemed to move differently inside the house. Clocks and devices no longer synchronized. The temperature fluctuated wildly, swinging from cold to heat in mere minutes. The hum of the clock was constant, a low vibration that made the windows tremble. As midnight approached, Dr. Chen's team showed that the temporal distortion had reached unprecedented levels. The blue glow of the marks was bright enough to illuminate the entire room. The space behind the pendulum no longer looked like a simple void. It was a whirlwind of darkness and light, constantly moving. At 11:59 p.m., the final message appeared. The choice is yours. Through the door lies a different path, an opportunity to explore what time truly means. Stay, and the door will close forever. The pendulum stopped. The vortex stabilized, transforming into a kind of door, a portal of energy swirling. Beyond it, I could see nothing, but it wasn't a place. It was more like the possibility of places, paths that branched out and reconnected, time flowing in patterns that I could barely comprehend. Dr. Chen looked on with wide eyes, absorbed by the phenomenon. This is, she whispered, a true temporal anomaly. The implications for physics are immense. I stood before the clock, feeling the pull of the vortex. The choice was clear: cross and explore whatever lay beyond, or stay in the world I knew. The hum transformed into a sort of song, promising adventures beyond imagination. But as I stood there, I thought about my life, my family, my work. I thought about my father, and his father before him, and their connection to this clock. I thought about the decisions, the consequences, the paths taken and the ones not taken. The seconds passed slowly. The vortex pulsed, waiting for my decision. At exactly midnight, I made my choice. I reached out and closed the door of the clock. The vortex collapsed upon itself with a sound like distant thunder. The blue glow faded, the marks on the face of the clock and the paper disappearing without a trace. The pendulum resumed its constant swing, ticking the time away. Dr. Chen's instruments showed how the temporal distortion dissipated, the energy patterns returning to normal. She looked at me, a silent understanding in her eyes. Sometimes, she said softly, the most important discoveries are the ones that remind us where we belong. Since then, the clock has kept perfect time. No more midnight resets. No more strange marks. No more temporal portals. But sometimes, late at night, I sit in my chair and watch it, listening to its ticking, and wonder about the roads not taken, the adventures not chosen, and the mysteries that lie hidden behind the familiar face of time. Dr. Chen published an article about the temporal anomaly, carefully anonymized to protect my privacy. It caused quite a stir in the scientific community, though no one has been able to replicate the conditions or explain exactly what happened. Sometimes she still comes to visit, taking readings and measurements, but the clock remains stubbornly normal. The piece of paper with the strange marks has disappeared as completely as the streaks on the face of the clock, but I kept detailed notes of everything that happened, locked away in the drawer of my desk. Sometimes I take them out and I read it over and over again, making sure it wasn't just a dream. The pendulum clock is still in my living room, ticking away with precision, looking exactly as it has for generations, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, nothing more. But occasionally, when the house is silent and the night is deep, I catch a glimpse of something in the reflection of the glass, a flash of blue light, perhaps. Or maybe it's just a reminder. I should have known that nothing good could come from an antique mirror with a suspiciously low price. I found it in an impromptu antique market, tucked away in an alley in the city. It was propped up against a brick wall, half covered by a blanket. Its frame was made of dark wood, carved with intricate geometric patterns that seemed to move if you stared at them for too long. "How much for the mirror?" I asked the vendor, a man with thinning hair and sunken eyes. "100, he replied, not even looking up at me. A ridiculous price for something that appeared so elaborate and old. We bargained until he agreed to sell it for 75, a good deal, I thought, as I carried it to my car. I hung it on the wall in my living room that same afternoon, right across from the sofa. The frame blended perfectly with the rest of the decor, and though the glass was slightly wavy, it added a unique touch to the space. I spent the rest of the day admiring how it reflected the light from the windows, giving the room a more open, airy feel. But that night, something strange happened. As I sat on the sofa, watching TV, something in the mirror caught my eye, a movement in the background of the reflection. Something dark and fast, like a shadow crossing the room behind me. I spun around immediately, but there was nothing. The room was empty, illuminated only by the blue glow of the screen. It must have been a reflection, or a play of the light, I thought, trying to calm myself. The next few days passed without incident, though I couldn't shake the feeling of constantly glancing at the mirror every time I walked past it. Then, on Tuesday night, it happened again. I was reading a book when I caught something moving in the mirror out of the corner of my eye. This time, it was clearer. A dark, humanoid figure slowly crossed the room, reflected in the glass. My body tensed, my heart raced. I forced myself not to look directly at it, fearing I would confirm what I had seen. Finally, I gathered the courage to look up. Nothing. Just my reflection and the room behind me, exactly as it should be. The following nights were worse. The figures appeared more frequently, always at the edges of my vision. Sometimes there was just one shadow, other times 2 or 3. They never stayed in one place for long, always slipping across the background of the mirror. I tried covering the mirror with a sheet one night, but when I woke up, the sheet was on the floor, carefully folded. The glass of the mirror seemed darker, as if something on the other side was absorbing the light. A week after I bought it, I dared to inspect the frame more closely. The carved geometric pattern seemed to form a design I hadn't noticed before, something that almost looked like text or some kind of code. But the more I tried to decipher it, the more my head ached. That night was the worst. I woke up at 3 a.m. with a cold sensation in the room. From my bed, I could see the living room through the cracked door, and the mirror, something was in it. A dark figure, more defined than the shadows I had seen before, stood directly behind my reflection. It had a vaguely human shape, but its body seemed to ripple like smoke trapped in a bottle. Its face was an empty void, a black hole that seemed to absorb all the light. I felt a cold weight on my shoulder, as though something invisible was touching me from behind. I couldn't move. My body was completely paralyzed by fear. Then, as if it had heard me, the figure raised an arm and pointed directly at my reflection. Somehow, I broke the spell. I ran out of the apartment without even grabbing my phone or keys, spending the rest of the night shaking in my car. The next morning, I returned with a hammer in hand, determined to get rid of the mirror. But when I entered, it wasn't where I had left it. It was propped up against the opposite wall, as if someone had moved it. Now I'm in a hotel, writing this. I left the mirror in the apartment, but I can't stop thinking about the figures. Were they watching me, or were they just waiting for something? Whatever it is, I don't intend to go back to find out. I can't sleep at night, not since what happened at the Rivers Apartments 2 months ago. I keep the curtains closed now, and I don't look out the windows after dark. There are some things you can never unsee. And some things follow you home. It all started 3 months ago when I moved into apartment 4B at Riverside. The building itself wasn't anything special, an old 6-story structure from the 1960s with creaky floors and temperamental heating. But the rent was affordable, and the location was perfect, just a short walk from my job at the downtown accounting firm. The first few weeks were nothing out of the ordinary. I'd get home from work, heat up something for dinner, maybe watch some Netflix. Occasionally, I'd sit on my small balcony at night, sipping a beer and watching the city lights flicker on. That was when I first noticed her. She was on a balcony 3 floors above mine and 2 units to the left, perfectly still, just staring out at the street. At first, I didn't think much of it. Lots of people step outside for fresh air at night. But after a few nights, I realized something wasn't quite right. She never moved, not a shift of her weight from one foot to the other, not a glance at her phone, no cigarette between her fingers. She just stood there, frozen like a statue, for hours, always in the same spot, always in the same position. I started to time her. She appeared exactly at 11:47 p.m. and disappeared at 3:33 a.m. What bothered me even more was the location of her balcony. It was on the 7th floor, but the building only had 6 stories. I convinced myself I was just miscounting the floors in the dark. But after 2 weeks of this, I began to pay closer attention. I set an alarm for 11:45 p.m. each night and waited. And sure enough, every night, right on time, there she was. With a pair of binoculars, I could make out more details. She was wearing what looked like an old dress, reaching down to her ankles, with a high collar. Her hair was long and dark, falling straight down her back. She never turned around. All of this sent chills down my spine, but I couldn't look away. I started losing sleep, spending those 4 hours just staring at her, frozen in place. My work began to suffer. Dark circles appeared under my eyes. I'd jump at the smallest noises. I needed answers. One morning, I found Mr. Peterson, the building manager, in the lobby. He was fixing a loose handrail, muttering under his breath as he struggled with a screwdriver. "Hey, quick question," I said, trying to sound casual. "That woman in 7C, the one who stands on her balcony at night, is she okay? I mean, she seems kind of weird." Peterson stopped what he was doing and looked at me, confused. 7C? Kid, this building only has 6 floors. My mouth went dry. But I've seen her every night. She stands there for hours, just staring out at the street. Peterson set the screwdriver down. "Look, maybe you're seeing someone from one of the buildings across the street, but there's no 7C here, and there definitely isn't a balcony that doesn't exist." I felt the cold rush through me, but he continued, lowering his voice. "The last tenant of 6C, just below where you're talking about, moved out 3 years ago. We had to seal that unit off after a flood ruined the entire floor. No one's lived there since." My hands began to tremble. "Are you sure? I've managed this building for 20 years, kid. I know how many floors it has." He picked up the screwdriver and went back to the handrail. Get some sleep, you need it. I barely made it through the rest of the day at work. My mind kept returning to what Peterson had said. I knew what I had seen every night for weeks. But how could she have been standing on a balcony that didn't exist? That night, I set my alarm for 11:45, just like before. My palms were sweating as I stepped out into the street. It was empty, except for a stray cat rummaging through a trash can. The windows above me were dark. At 11:47 p.m., she appeared. Same position. Same dress. Same long hair. And then it hit me. Something wasn't just wrong, it was completely impossible. The night was dark, but there was something different this time. I wasn't looking out toward the street anymore. It was staring directly at me. A chill swept through my entire body, and I gripped the balcony railing to steady myself. Through the binoculars, I could see her more clearly now. Her dress was faded and torn, her hair, once dark, was tangled, matted with something that appeared to be black under the dim light. But most unsettling of all was her face, or rather, the absence of one. Where features should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Yet somehow, I knew she was looking at me, had been watching me all along. The binoculars slipped from my hands and crashed against the floor of the balcony with a deafening bang. My legs gave way, and I collapsed to the ground, my heart racing so fast that I thought it might stop. She didn't move. She didn't react. She just kept staring at me with that blank, smooth face, and it felt like time itself had frozen. I crawled inside, slamming the door shut behind me and yanking the curtains down to shield myself from her gaze. My hands shook so violently that I could barely latch the lock. I grabbed my phone to call Peterson, but then I remembered it was nearly midnight. The night stretched on endlessly. I sat in my living room, every light in the apartment blindingly bright, too afraid to close my eyes. The tiniest sound sent me into a panic. The heater clicked on, and I nearly screamed. A car horn blared outside, and I threw myself behind the sofa, my heart thundering in my chest. At 3:33 a.m., something compelled me to look toward the balcony again. Through a small gap in the curtains, I saw the night sky, and then, against it, her face. That same smooth, featureless face was pressed against the balcony door, staring at me. I ran. I didn't grab my keys, my wallet, nothing. I just ran, down 4 flights of stairs in my socks, out into the street. I spent the rest of the night in a 24-hour cafe, sipping coffee with trembling hands, jumping every time someone passed by the window. At dawn, I went back to gather some clothes. The balcony door was still locked. There were no fingerprints in the dust, no sign that anyone had been there. But when I looked toward where apartment 7C should have been, my blood ran cold. The brick wall was distorted, like a funhouse mirror, bulging out in some spots, sinking inward in others. And at the center of that distortion was the perfect outline of a balcony, one that shouldn't have existed. That same day, I moved out. I found a hotel downtown and began searching for a new apartment. I now live on the ground floor, no balconies. But sometimes, late at night, I catch a movement in my peripheral vision, a flash of dark hair, a faded dress, and when I turn, there's nothing there. I know she followed me. I can feel her watching, waiting. Every night at 11:47, I feel the compulsion to look out the window, to see if she's there. But I don't. I can't. Because I know what I'll see, that smooth, empty face staring at me through the glass. The police didn't believe me when I filed the report. Peterson swears the building never had a 7th floor. I spoke with other tenants, and none of them had seen her. Sometimes I wonder if it was all in my head. But then I remember that face, horrible, smooth, and empty, pressed against my balcony door, and I know it was real. It was all real. I still don't know what she wants. Why me? Why does she follow me? But I know she's out there, standing perfectly still in the dark, waiting for me to look again. That's why I keep the curtains closed. I stay away from the windows after dark. And every night at 11:47, I turn up the volume on the TV to drown out any sounds from outside, because I know that if I dare peek between the curtains, she'll be there. And this time, she might be closer than ever, closer than the balcony. The doctors say I suffer from paranoid delusions caused by stress and sleep deprivation. They prescribed me anxiety medication and recommended therapy. Maybe they're right. Maybe my mind created all of this to cope with the pressure of my new job and living alone. But I don't think so. Because sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear something. A soft scraping sound, like nails against glass. And even though the curtains are closed, even though my back is turned to the windows, I can feel it. The gaze without eyes, piercing through me, waiting for me to turn around. I've started looking for jobs in other cities. Maybe if I move far enough away, it won't be able to follow me, but deep down, I know that doesn't matter. Whatever it is, whatever she is, distance means nothing to her. She will find me. So here I stay, in my ground floor apartment, curtains drawn, lights on, writing this, hoping maybe someone will read it and understand. Maybe someone else has seen her too. Or perhaps all of this is truly just in my head, and one day I'll look back and laugh at how I let my imagination run wild. But I don't think so. Because it's 11:46 at night right now, and in 1 minute she'll appear somewhere outside. And even though I can't see her, even though I won't look, I know she'll be there, staring at me with that smooth, empty face. Always waiting. Always waiting. I should have suspected something when the building owner refused to give me a tour of the basement. It's just storage, he said, waving his hand as if it didn't matter. No one uses it, hasn't for years. The rest of the building seemed perfect. Beautiful Art Deco structure from the 1920s with high ceilings and intricate moldings. The apartment on the 4th floor was spacious and bright, and the price was surprisingly low for the neighborhood. I took it without thinking twice. During the first few months, everything was normal. The building had its charm, creaky floors, groaning pipes, but nothing unusual, nothing out of place. Until one night, while I was sleeping, I heard something strange. A dull thud, as if something heavy had fallen from a great height. It woke me up immediately. The sound seemed to come from beneath my bed, but when I checked, there was nothing there. The next day, I mentioned the noise to the superintendent, an old man named Arturo. Must have been the old heater in the basement, he said indifferently. Makes noises sometimes. That same night, I heard the thud again. But this time, it wasn't just one. It was 3, in quick succession, then silence. The following days, the noises continued, thuds, creaks, even a sound that seemed like a distant whisper. The superintendent insisted it was the heating system, but something didn't add up. The sounds had no logical pattern, and more worryingly, they seemed to be getting closer. One night, I finally gathered the courage to go down to the basement. I grabbed a flashlight and an iron bar, feeling like the protagonist of a bad horror movie. The basement was a maze of dark hallways, filled with forgotten objects, dusty boxes, broken furniture, and a strange smell of dampness and rust. But what troubled me the most was a metal door at the end of the hallway. It wasn't locked, but it seemed sealed shut by rust. With some effort, I managed to open it. Behind it, there was a staircase that led even further down. The air was colder there, and the smell of rust was stronger. At the bottom of the stairs was a room. The floor was covered with an odd pattern of dark stains, as if something had been spilled and never fully cleaned up. In the center of the room, there was a well. The well was covered with a rusted iron grate, but from my position, I could see that it was deep, so deep that the light from my flashlight couldn't reach the bottom. That's when I heard it. A barely audible whisper, like a chorus of tiny, distant voices. It seemed to be coming from the well. I stepped closer, my hands trembling as I pointed the flashlight at the grate. The voices grew louder, almost as if they were begging. My stomach churned when I realized that some of the words were clearly intelligible. "Help us. Please." I immediately stepped back, stumbling over a piece of wood on the floor. My flashlight fell, briefly illuminating a corner of the room. There, carved into the wall, were symbols I didn't recognize, deeply etched into the concrete. I ran. I rushed up the stairs and I closed the metal door behind me, my breath erratic as I leaned against it, trying to steady myself. On the other side I could hear it. The whispers? They had started as a faint murmur, but now they were louder, more urgent. That night sleep eluded me, and in the days that followed, the strange sounds in my apartment only grew worse. It wasn't just knocking anymore. Now I could hear the sound of footsteps, dragging across the ceiling and walls. And there were no neighbors above me. The lights flickered incessantly, casting shadows that seemed to dance, mocking the silence. One evening, I noticed a dark stain on the floor, a patch I was sure hadn't been there the night before. My attempts to reach out to the landlord were fruitless. He never answered my calls. Arturo, the superintendent, just shrugged when I brought up the well. "It's better to leave those things alone," he said, avoiding my gaze. At last, I made the decision to move. I packed my things in one night, leaving the rest behind. As I climbed into the taxi with my suitcases, I took one last look at the building. In one of the basement windows, I swear I saw a dark figure, motionless, staring back at me. I've never walked down that street since. Though I no longer live there, sometimes, in the stillness of the early morning, I could swear I hear those whispers again. The first time I heard them was 3 nights after I moved into Unit 407 at Hawkwood Apartments. A soft, rhythmic sound came from somewhere behind my headboard. At first, I thought it was just the building settling or the ventilation system acting up. These old pre-war buildings always had their quirks, and for $400 a month in this part of town, I didn't expect perfection. That first week, the sound was barely perceptible. A faint back and forth, like someone breathing deeply in their sleep. I would lie in bed, drifting off toward midnight, and every now and then, my attention would be pulled toward the barely audible whisper of air. I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to determine if the sound came from the neighboring apartment. The wall felt cold against my skin, and the sound seemed to fade in and out, like waves crashing on a distant shore. Probably just a neighbor, I told myself, pulling away from the wall and turning up the volume on my phone to drown it out. These old buildings had thin walls, after all. But by the second week, something changed. The breathing grew louder, more distinct. It no longer came from a fixed point, it seemed to move along the wall, creeping closer, night by night. I started to track its progress, using sticky notes to mark the spots on the wall where I heard the sound. Every morning, I would wake up to find that the breath had moved a few inches closer to my pillow. The rental office was no help. Sandra, the property manager, just smiled and shook her head when I mentioned the issue. "Mr. Chin in 408 is a very quiet tenant," she said, tapping her pen on a pile of lease renewals. "We've never had any complaints about him in 3 years. Are you sure you're not just getting used to the normal sounds of the building?" I wasn't convinced. That night, I knocked on Mr. Chen's door. A small man in his 60s, wearing reading glasses and a cardigan, answered. His apartment looked like a mirror image of mine, but it felt warmer. Family photos adorned the walls, and the air was thick with the scent of jasmine tea. "Breathing sounds?" he asked, frowning. "I don't sleep with earplugs. My wife snores." He chuckled, pointing to an older woman sleeping on a chair by the window. "But I'm usually in bed by 9. It could be the person below you." The next day, I checked with the tenant in 307. The woman who answered was in her 20s, like me, with dark circles under her eyes that suggested she worked night shifts. She shook her head before I could even finish explaining. I'm never home at night, she said. I work at the hospital. The breathing continued its slow migration along the wall. By the third week, it had moved from behind my headboard to just beside my pillow. I started sleeping on the couch, but even from there, I could hear it, a slow, steady inhalation and exhalation that filled the room. Each breath seemed heavier, more deliberate. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. It was like the sound was following me, lingering in every corner of the apartment. The constant exhalations that seemed to follow me throughout the apartment drove me to start documenting everything. I set up my phone to record the sounds during the night, but the recordings always came out blurry, unclear, like they were corrupted in some way. Desperate for answers, I started taking photos of the walls, searching for cracks, holes, or any unusual marks. But there was nothing. No sign of anything out of the ordinary. In a last-ditch effort, I'd borrowed an infrared thermometer from work and checked the apartment for cold spots. The temperature remained constant across every surface, without variation. One night, unable to sleep, I pressed my palm firmly against the wall where the breathing seemed strongest. The surface vibrated slightly with each exhalation, and I could swear I felt heat radiating through the plaster. I jerked my hand away abruptly, my heart pounding in my chest. The breathing stopped for a moment, only to resume, faster now, more erratic. I began digging into the history of the building. The Oakwood was constructed in 1928, renovated in the 70s, and again in the early 2000s. There were no reports of deaths or mysterious disappearances in my unit, nothing that would explain what I was experiencing. The local historical society had old newspaper archives, but after hours of sifting through microfilms, all I found were building code violations from the 80s. The lack of answers made everything worse. I could almost handle the thought of a spirit if I knew its story, but this shapeless, originless breathing was driving me to the edge. I started staying out late, visiting bars after work just to avoid going home. My performance at the office suffered. Dark circles appeared under my eyes, the same as my downstairs neighbor. "You look terrible," my coworker Dave told me one morning over coffee. "Everything okay with the new place?" He was just trying to make conversation, but I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to spill the truth, to let him know what I was dealing with. But I knew how it would sound, absurd, insane. So I shrugged. "Still getting used to it, I guess. Old buildings take time to adjust to." But I wasn't adjusting. The breathing had moved again, this time right above my pillow when I tried to sleep. I could hear it clearly, even with earplugs in, even with a white noise machine blasting at full volume. It had changed in nature, becoming wetter, as though someone was breathing through a stuffy nose. I began sleeping in 2-hour shifts, avoiding deep sleep at all costs. I even covered the wall with soundproof panels, but they only seemed to amplify the noise, channeling it straight to the foot of my bed. The sound followed me, positioning itself near my ear. The breaking point came a month after everything had started. I woke up at 3 in the morning, finding myself pressed against the wall, my ear flat against the surface, as if something had pulled me there while I slept. The breathing was right there, so close that I could feel as if someone's lips were almost touching my ear. I could feel the warm air moving against my skin, brushing lightly against it. I jumped back, my heart hammering in my chest so violently, I thought it would burst out of me. My t-shirt was soaked with sweat, and my legs shook as I backed away from the wall. But the breathing followed, trailing after me across the room. And then, for the first time, I heard something new. A deep, resonant sound. I could hear it, a harsh sound beneath the breath, almost like a raspy laugh. That was enough. I grabbed my laptop, my phone, and a change of clothes, stuffed them all into a backpack, and ran. I spent the night at a 24-hour cafe, sipping coffee and scrolling through short-term rental listings on my phone. When the rental office opened at 9 a.m., I was already waiting outside. "I need to break my lease," I told Sandra, sliding my keys across her desk. "I'll pay whatever penalty is necessary." She started to protest, reminding me of the terms of the contract, but something in my face must have stopped her. Maybe it was the wild look in my eyes, or the visible tremble in my hands. She sighed and handed me a form. "Fill this out," she said. "We'll have to charge you until the end of next month, but after that you're free." I signed everything without reading it. I wrote a check for the remaining balance and left. My hands finally stopped shaking. Later that day, I went back to gather my furniture, with a few friends helping me move quickly. While I was waiting for my Uber outside, I glanced up at the fourth-floor window. Through the glass, I could see the foam panels I had installed, still perfectly aligned against the wall. And for a moment, just before I reached my car, I swear I saw one of them shift slightly, pressing inward and outward, as if something was breathing behind it. I moved in with my sister temporarily while I searched for a new place. She had so many questions about why I left my apartment so suddenly, but I dodged them. How could I explain what had happened without sounding insane? Instead, I told her that the commute to work was too long, that the building was old, that the rent was too high. 2 months later, I found a newer apartment in another part of the city. The walls are thin enough that I can hear my neighbors watching TV, arguing, living their lives. Sometimes, late at night, I stay awake listening to those normal, human sounds, grateful for their mundane clarity. I never went back to Unit 407. I hired a moving company to pick up my furniture, telling them to leave anything that didn't fit in the truck behind. Sometimes I think about the next tenant. I wonder if they've already heard it, the soft, persistent sound of breathing, moving through the wall like a living thing. I wonder if they're lying awake now, tracing its slow progress across the wall, feeling it draw closer, night after night. But I try not to think about it too much. I focus on the present, on my new apartment with its solid walls and mechanical sounds. I've started sleeping better, though I still keep my bed away from the wall, just in case. The only thing I kept from my old apartment was the infrared thermometer. It's in a drawer of my desk, unused. Sometimes, late at night, I'm tempted to take it out and measure the temperature of the walls in my new bedroom. But I never do. Some things are better left unmeasured. Some questions are better left unanswered. I drove by Hobwood once, a few months after I moved. It was a cold Sunday morning, and the building looked the same as always. Red bricks, white trim, iron fire escapes zigzagging across the facade. I counted the windows up to the 4th floor, spotting what I thought was 407. The lights were on, the curtains closed. I stood there for a while, thinking about knocking on the door to warn whoever lived there now. But what would I say? How could I explain what I experienced without sounding insane? In the end, I left, leaving the building and its secrets behind. But sometimes, in those moments between sleep and wakefulness, when the world is still and quiet, I find myself listening. Not for anything specific, just listening, waiting. In those moments, I have to remind myself that the soft sound I hear is just my own breath, nothing more. The walls surrounding me are nothing but solid, silent barriers, and what once lived in the walls of Unit 407 is long behind me. At least, that's what I tell myself. That's what I must believe in order to sleep at night, to function during the day, to move on with my life. But there are rare occasions. Occasions when I am alone in my new apartment, and I press my ear against the wall, just to be sure, just to confirm that all I hear is my own breath. And until now, it's always been that way. Until now. The old rotary phone sat on my nightstand, a keepsake from my grandfather that I couldn't bring myself to throw away after his death. The cream-colored plastic had yellowed with age, and the metal dialer made a satisfying click, click, click when I turned it. I kept it out of nostalgia, even though it wasn't plugged in. That's why the sound of the ringer startled me awake at 3:17 a.m. that Tuesday. The metallic, mechanical noise cut through the darkness, jerking me upright in bed. My heart raced as I stared at the phone, trying to process what I was hearing. The ringer. 2 short rings. A pause. Then, repeating the same pattern I remembered from visits to my grandparents' house when I was a child. This can't be happening, I muttered. Music. Then, something else, soft, labored breathing, and then I heard it clearly. Laughter. It wasn't joyful or friendly, but weak, gasping chuckles that sent a chill down my arms. It lasted maybe 5 seconds before the line fell silent. I sat there, holding the receiver, listening to the silence. My hands were trembling as I slowly placed the receiver back on the base. I followed the cable with my eyes, tracing it to where it disappeared behind the nightstand. When I pulled it out, the end was worn and frayed, just as I knew it would be. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I kept telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the phone had stored some charge in its capacitor somehow. Maybe it had all been a dream. By morning, I had almost convinced myself that it was nothing, until it happened again the next night. This time, the ringer started at 3:21 a.m. I lay there for several rings, watching the phone vibrate slightly with each sound. Finally, I picked it up. "Who are you?" I demanded. The static was louder this time, and so was the laughter. That same weak chuckle, but now there were more voices. A chorus of intertwined laughs created an echo that churned my stomach. They lasted longer than before, maybe 15 seconds. When they stopped, I slammed the receiver down. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to grip the edge of the nightstand to steady myself. Sweat soaked through my t-shirt. The next day, I spent hours researching old phones. I searched for any logical explanation. Maybe it was picking up radio signals, interference from nearby lines. But nothing I found made sense. That night, I dismantled the phone completely. The internal components were dusty but intact. There was no battery, no power source, nothing that could explain how it was working. I left the parts scattered across my desk. "Try to ring now," I whispered to it. At 3:24 a.m., the ringer ripped me out of my dreams. The phone was still disassembled, but the ringing was as clear as ever. The receiver, separate from the rest, rested among the parts, but its cord was snapped and twisted. I picked up the receiver with trembling hands. "What do you want?" I asked. The static filled the air immediately, followed by that horrible sound. There were more voices now, dozens of them, laughing in a chaotic mess of echoes, gasps, and cackles that seemed to come from the depths of a dark well. The sound filled my head until I could barely think. And then, a voice rose above the others, a wet, macabre gurgling that could not have come from human vocal cords. I threw the headset across the room. It slammed against the wall, leaving a small dent in the plaster. The laughter stopped immediately. My entire body trembled as I gathered the pieces of the phone into a trash bag. I drove to the dumpster behind my building and tossed it inside. Then I sat in my car until dawn, too frightened to return to my apartment. The next night, I checked into a hotel, took a sleeping pill, and fell asleep watching television. The phone next to the bed woke me at 3:27 a.m. I already knew what I would hear before I answered. Static came first, followed by the laughter, deafening now, a frantic and mocking celebration. "Wrong number," a guttural voice said, and the laughter erupted again with renewed intensity, filling my ears until I felt my head was going to explode. I slammed the phone down and bolted from the room. The receptionist looked at me alarmed as I rushed out. "Is something wrong, sir?" he asked. "The phone in my room," I said, breathless. "Who's calling it?" He furrowed his brow and checked his computer. "There are no external lines connected to the rooms right now. We're updating our phone system," he said. It was then that I realized I couldn't escape this. I returned home at dawn, dazed, my mind foggy. I felt like a ghost wandering through my own life. When I reached my apartment, I could barely turn the key in the lock. The old phone was there, perfectly assembled, as if I had never taken it apart or thrown it in the dumpster. It was sitting on my nightstand, exactly where I had placed it the first time. I stepped back, closing the bedroom door behind me and putting a chair under the knob. I collapsed on the couch in the living room, unable to escape the ringing in my head. That afternoon, I went to my grandfather's house. It had been sold after his death, but I found the new owners outside working in the garden. They were a kind, middle-aged couple, and when I explained who I was, they invited me inside. "We actually had a problem with the phone lines," said the husband as he led me to my grandfather's old study. "The inspector noticed some unusual wiring in the walls, but we haven't had time to investigate." The study had been painted yellow, but in essence, it looked the same. The man pointed to a panel behind where my grandfather's desk used to be. "Do you see these marks? They don't match any standard telephone wiring diagram." I leaned in to take a closer look. Carved into the wood around the phone socket were dozens of small symbols, circles and lines arranged in patterns I didn't recognize. They formed a complete ring around the socket. "Your grandfather wasn't involved in any occult stuff, was he?" the wife asked hesitantly. "We found similar marks in other rooms, always near the phone jacks." I slowly shook my head. "Not as far as I know. He was a telephone engineer. He worked for the company his whole life." The husband scratched his head. "Well, we're planning to replace all the wiring anyway. Thanks for coming." I sat in my car for a long time after leaving, thinking about my grandfather. He had never shown any interest in the supernatural, but now I remembered how he always insisted on having phones in every room, even after everyone started using cell phones. How he would obsessively check the lines, testing connections, replacing cables. How sometimes, late at night, he would sit in his study, simply holding the handset to his ear. What had he been listening to that night? I didn't try to sleep. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, staring at the closed door to my bedroom. At 3:30 a.m., the phone began to ring. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the sound cut through, loud and clear. After 12 rings, it stopped. Then, the laughter began. I didn't need the handset to hear it now. The voices were frantic, a cacophony of laughter and murmuring that leaked under the door to my bedroom. The laughter reached a crescendo, then I heard something new, a click, like the sound of someone dialing numbers quickly. The door to my bedroom vibrated slightly, as if something was pushing it from the other side. The air filled with static, a buzzing pressure that seemed to push me into the sofa. The laughter grew deafening, echoing in every corner of the room. And then I realized something more terrifying was coming. And then, through the noise, I distinguished words: wrong number, wrong number, wrong number. The voices reveled in their mockery. My vision began to fade as the pressure mounted. Before losing consciousness, I saw the old phone floating in the air at the center of the room. Its cord twisted like a live wire, and the rotary dial spun frantically. I woke up in the hospital. A doctor told me that my neighbors had found me unconscious in the hallway outside my apartment. I was diagnosed with extreme exhaustion and kept under observation. When I returned to my apartment 2 days later, the phone was gone. In its place was a note, written in my grandfather's shaky handwriting: "They keep trying to call." I held them off for as long as I could. Your grandmother and we both did. I'm sorry. I should have destroyed the phones before I died. They'll find someone else to dial now. Just remember, never answer a call after midnight. Never complete the connection. They just need a voice to open the line. I moved out of that apartment. I changed my number. I no longer have a landline. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I still hear a ghostly ring or an echo of that awful laugh. But as long as I don't answer, as long as I don't complete the connection, I know I'm safe. What worries me, though, are all those other landlines forgotten in houses and offices. Those people who might answer when they hear the first ring in the darkness of the night. So I shared this warning: if a disconnected phone rings after midnight, don't answer it. Don't give them a voice. On this side of the line, they're dialing at random, desperately, endlessly, and all they need is for someone to pick up the receiver. Let it ring. The first time I noticed something strange with the pendulum clock was on a quiet afternoon in October. I was sitting in the living room, trying to concentrate on answering work emails when the deep, resonant chimes that had marked the days of my life for years suddenly stopped abruptly, mid-strike. The silence caught my attention instantly. I looked up from my laptop screen and saw the clock's hands frozen at 11:58 p.m., even though my phone showed it was 7:43 p.m. I got up from my chair and walked over to the imposing mahogany pendulum clock. I opened the glass door that protected its face and adjusted the hands to the correct time. As soon as I closed the door, the pendulum resumed its swinging motion, ticking away the seconds with its familiar tick-tock. Everything seemed normal until, 20 minutes later, the chimes rang out again, 12 chimes, marking midnight. I frowned and checked my phone. It was 8:03 p.m. The clock hands had once again struck midnight, ignoring my previous adjustment. It must be a mechanical issue, I thought, making a mental note to call a specialist the next day. The following morning, I found the clock stopped again at midnight. This time, I noticed something else: fine marks on the face of the clock that hadn't been there before. They weren't deep, but they formed a strange pattern around the number 12. I touched the marks, feeling a slight indentation on the smooth surface of the clock. I called Frank, a clockmaker who had previously serviced the clock. Frank was an older man with thick glasses and years of experience working with intricate mechanisms. I explained the problem to him, and he agreed to stop by my house the following day to check it out. That night, I decided to stay awake to observe the clock. I placed my laptop on the coffee table and made myself a strong cup of coffee, preparing for a long night ahead. I settled into the armchair, waiting for something to happen. The hands of the clock moved normally, ticking along until 11:57 p.m. Then, the ticking changed. It became slower, heavier, the sound reminding me of footsteps on an old staircase. A chill ran down my spine as the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The pendulum began to swing erratically, swaying at strange angles. The usual sound turned into a metallic screech that made me shudder. When the hands struck midnight, the clock did not emit its usual chimes. Instead, I heard an unsettling sound, a long, high-pitched screech, like nails scraping against a chalkboard. The hands quickly spun backward, moving in the opposite direction of the clock's usual rotation, until they stopped once more at 12. My heart raced as I approached the clock, my breath catching in my chest. New markings had appeared on the clock face, deeper this time, forming a pattern that resembled words, but in a language I could not identify. When I touched the glass, it was ice cold. I stepped back, distancing myself from the clock. The pendulum had come to a halt, but a faint buzzing sound began to emanate from inside the clock's casing. It wasn't mechanical, it was something living, like a deep murmur vibrating in the air. That night I couldn't sleep. I stayed in the chair, staring at the clock from across the room, with the lights on and my laptop recording in silence. The next morning, Frank arrived promptly at 9 a.m., carrying his toolbox, glasses, and his usual calm demeanor. I told him what had happened, trying not to sound insane. Frank carefully inspected the clock, adjusting his glasses as he examined the markings on the face. As midnight approached, his instruments began to register more intense fluctuations. The temperature dropped several degrees, and the marks on the clock face began to glow again. "Here we go," he muttered, adjusting one of his devices. At 11:59, the door of the clock opened again, revealing the pulsating void. This time, Dr. Chen saw it too. "This is impossible," she said, her voice trembling. "The space behind the clock can't be that deep. It shouldn't exist." The message on the clock face changed. "Tomorrow at midnight, the door will open completely." Choose to pass through or stay behind. The void seemed to pulse, and the symbols on the paper vibrated in sync with the markings on the clock. Dr. Chen tried to measure the depth of the void, but her instruments stopped working. "Whatever's happening here is building up," she said while hurriedly packing up her equipment. "Tomorrow will be critical." The last day felt surreal. The clock seemed normal during the daylight hours, but deep down, I knew something was changing. Dr. Chun returned in the evening with more equipment, and an assistant feverishly taking notes. As midnight approached, the pressure in the room grew. The hum intensified, resonating in every corner of the house. At 11 p.m., the final message appeared: "The door opens. Step forward or stay behind." The door of the clock swung wide open, revealing a vortex of light and shadow. I could see fragments of something beyond, paths diverging, places I had never seen but somehow recognized. Dr. Chin watched, her eyes wide open, recording every detail. "This is a time bridge," she said breathlessly. "A connection between planes." The hum transformed into a hypnotic chant, full of promises of infinite possibilities. I stood before the clock, feeling the pull of the vortex. The message on the clock face changed for the last time: "Choose. This is your last chance." I looked at Dr. Chin. "What will happen if I go in?" She shook her head, unable to answer. I took a deep breath, but at the last moment, I stepped back and slammed the door shut. The vortex collapsed in an instant. The blue glow faded, and the room fell silent. Dr. Chen looked at me with a mixture of relief and disappointment. "Sometimes," she said, "not choosing a path is also an important choice." Since that night, the clock has remained silent. The markings vanished, and the chimes returned to their usual sound. Dr. Chen published an article about the phenomenon, though she omitted specific details. No one has been able to replicate the anomaly. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the room at night, I see a blue flash in the reflection of the glass and wonder what I would have found on the other side. I should have passed by the garage sale sign. It was a sunny Saturday, and the small front yard was filled with tables covered in knickknacks, old clocks, dusty books, and porcelain figurines. But what caught my attention was the music box. It was small, made of dark wood, with a worn finish, as if it had been handled by many hands over the years. The lid was decorated with floral engravings, and when I opened it, I saw a small oval mirror and a broken dancer with a missing leg. An elderly woman, who seemed to be the owner, approached when I picked it up. "Are you interested?" she asked with a strange smile. "Maybe how much?" I asked. "But a warning," she said, her voice lowering. "Don't leave it open too long." The way she said it, as though sharing a dark secret, gave me chills. But I laughed nervously and paid. I didn't believe in superstitions, and the box seemed like a curious object to decorate my desk. When I got home, I cleaned it up and wound it. The mechanism still worked, and a soft melody began to play. I recognized the song but couldn't recall its name. I watched as the dancer spun slowly on her axis, despite her awkward movement from being broken. Then I noticed something strange. The reflection in the mirror didn't quite match the room behind me. The reflection seemed darker, and the shadows in it moved, although nothing in my room did. I leaned closer to inspect, but suddenly the music stopped. I quickly shut the box and stepped back, feeling foolish for getting scared. That night, curiosity got the better of me. I opened the box again, wound it up, and sat on the bed, watching the mirror. This time, what I saw was clearer. At the back of the reflection, there was something, or someone, a dark figure, motionless, staring at me. My heart raced, but I couldn't look away. The melody slowed as if the mechanism were failing, and the figure's reflection began to move, creeping toward the edge of the mirror. I slammed the box shut. The room fell silent, but I felt watched. That night, I slept poorly, waking up constantly with the sense that something was standing at the foot of my bed. In the days that followed, the box seemed to call to me. Every time I passed by my desk, I felt a pressure in my chest, as though something was forcing me to open it. I finally gave in, opened the box, and wound it. This time, I didn't sit to watch it. I let the music fill the room while I focused on something else. But I couldn't help but glance at the mirror. The figure was there again, more defined. This time, I could make out a pale face with dark eyes like bottomless pits. When the music stopped, the figure smiled. I turned off the lights and left the box in a corner of the closet that night, hoping to forget about it. But it wasn't that easy. At midnight I woke to a sound, the melody of the box, slow and distorted, as if it were playing by itself. I found it open on my desk, although I was sure I had closed it. The dancer was spinning, and in the mirror, the figure wasn't at the back anymore, it was on the edge, as though about to step out. I slammed the box shut so hard I thought I'd break it, then took it to the basement. I placed it in a sealed box with tape and left it in a dark corner. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the melody in my head, like an echo. The next morning, I decided to get rid of the box. I took it to an empty field on the outskirts of the city, and buried it as deep as I could. But when I returned home, I found it on my desk, open, with the broken dancer spinning slowly, and that figure in the mirror. Since then, the music box has always been with me. No matter what I do, it always returns. I've burned it, buried it, thrown it in the river. It always comes back. The figure in the mirror is no longer motionless. It moves with every opening, getting closer to the edge. Every time I hear the melody, I know it's closer to coming out. And when it finally does, I'm not sure what will happen.